My name is Patricia Stevens, and I worked the night shift at Clearwater Psychiatric Hospital for 11 years. Night nursing in a psychiatric facility requires particular skills, patience, vigilance, and the ability to distinguish between legitimate emergencies and the routine crises that emerge when darkness amplifies existing anxieties. Ward A housed our most challenging patients, individuals requiring constant monitoring due to severe behavioral issues or acute psychological episodes. 32 rooms arranged along a single corridor with the nurses' station positioned for optimal observation of all patient areas. During my orientation in 2003, Charge Nurse Martinez walked me through standard protocols, medication schedules, documentation requirements, emergency procedures. But when we reached the end of Ward A's corridor, she stopped at the final door without opening it. "Room 33 is not part of your duties," she said simply. "The door remains locked. Patients are not assigned to this room. If anyone asks about it, you direct them to administration." The door looked identical to every other patient room. Standard institutional hardware, safety glass window, room number clearly marked. But unlike the other rooms, Room 33's window was covered from inside with what appeared to be heavy paper or cardboard, blocking any view of the interior. "What's inside?" I asked. "Storage," Martinez replied, though her tone suggested the topic was closed to further discussion. I noticed the key ring at the nurse's station included a key marked 33, positioned between the keys for rooms 32 and 34. When I asked about it, during my first solo shift, the day nurse shrugged. "It's always been there. Never used it, never needed to." For my first 6 months, room 33 remained a minor curiosity. Patients walked past it without acknowledgement. Staff treated it as invisible, and my duties focused on the 32 active rooms that required constant attention. But I began noticing small details that didn't align with the storage explanation. The door showed signs of recent maintenance, fresh paint, updated safety mechanisms, properly functioning locks. Not the neglected appearance I'd expect from a storage room that hadn't been opened in years. And late at night, when the ward was quiet, I sometimes heard faint sounds from behind the covered window. Not mechanical sounds that might indicate HVAC equipment or utility systems, but organic sounds, rustling, shifting, the occasional soft thump that suggested movement inside the room. "Do you ever hear anything from room 33? I asked during shift change one morning. Day Nurse Thompson paused in her report. "Hear what?" "Movement. Sounds like someone's inside." "It's storage, Patricia. Maybe settling building materials or temperature changes. Old hospitals make all kinds of noises." But the sounds weren't random. They followed patterns, occurred at specific times, and seemed to respond to activity in the corridor. When I walked past room 33 during rounds, the sounds would pause, resume, after I'd moved away, as if someone inside were listening to my footsteps. The patients noticed too, though they reacted differently than staff. Most avoided the end of the corridor entirely, finding reasons to turn back before reaching room 33. Those who did approach the door would stop, stand motionless for several seconds, then leave quickly without explanation. "What do you see when you look at room 33? I asked patient Morrison during medication distribution. He glanced toward the end of the corridor, then back at me with a confused expression. "What room? The hallway ends at 32, but room 33 was clearly visible from where we stood. Door, number, window covered from inside." Morrison was looking directly at it while claiming it didn't exist. In November, I decided to test the door myself. During a quiet period around 3 a.m., I took the room 33 key from the nurse's station and walked to the end of the corridor. The sounds from inside had been more frequent lately. Definite movement, occasional impacts against the door, what sounded like someone trying to get out. I inserted the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, mechanism functioning perfectly, but when I tried the door handle, it wouldn't move. Not locked. The handle itself seemed frozen in place, as if welded to prevent opening. I tried the key again, applied pressure to the handle, even used both hands to force it. Nothing. The lock disengaged properly, but the door remained sealed, by some mechanism I couldn't identify. That's when I heard the alarm, not the general ward alarm or medical emergency signal. A different sound, high-pitched and continuous, coming from inside room 33. The covered window began glowing with red light, pulsing in rhythm with the alarm. I returned to the nurse's station and checked the alarm panel. No alerts, no emergency indicators, all systems showing normal status. But the sound from room 33 continued for 17 minutes before stopping abruptly. The following morning, I reported the incident to Nurse Martinez. Room 33's alarm activated around 3 a.m. Should I file a maintenance request? What alarm? She asked, checking the duty log. No alarms were reported during your shift. The key turns, but the door won't open. Something's wrong with the handle mechanism. Martinez walked with me to room 33, tried the key herself, confirmed that the lock functioned but the handle remained frozen. I'll contact maintenance, she said, though her expression suggested she was humoring my concerns rather than addressing a genuine problem. The maintenance work order was filed, but 3 weeks passed without any response. The door remained locked, the handle immobile, the window covered from inside. But the sounds continued, growing more frequent and more distinct. By December, I could identify specific patterns: movement that suggested pacing, impacts that sounded like someone striking the door from inside, and what might have been voices, too muffled to understand but rhythmic enough to suggest conversation. On December 18th, during my routine 2 a.m. rounds, I found patient Davis standing at room 33's door. "Mr. Davis, you should be in your room." He didn't respond, didn't acknowledge my presence, just stood motionless, facing the covered window, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. "Mr. Davis?" He turned slowly, looked at me with an expression of profound sadness. "She's asking for help," he said quietly. "Every night she asks for help." "Who's asking for help?" "The nurse. Behind the door. She's been there so long." I guided Davis back to his room, noting the incident in my report, but his words stayed with me. Not because I believed them, but because of how certain he'd sounded. The next night, I positioned myself where I could observe room 33 without being obvious. 3 patients approached the door during my shift. Davis again, Mrs. Henderson from room 19, and Mr. Rodriguez from room 8. Each stood motionless for several minutes, each left looking disturbed. "What do you hear at room 33? I asked Mrs. Henderson the following morning. "Crying," she said without hesitation. "Someone crying for help, can't you hear it?" I couldn't, but that night I brought a stethoscope and pressed it against room 33's door. Through the metal, I heard something that made my hands shake. A woman's voice, faint but clear, saying "please" over and over again. I jerked back from the door, stethoscope falling to the floor. The voice stopped immediately, replaced by complete silence that felt more unnatural than any sound I'd heard. On January 3rd, I arrived for my shift to find maintenance personnel at room 33. 2 men with tools examining the door hardware under Martinez's supervision. "Finally getting it fixed?" I asked. Martinez looked confused. "Getting what fixed?" "The door handle. The maintenance request from November." "There's no maintenance request on file for room 33. These men are here to remove the door handle entirely." I watched as they dismantled the handle mechanism, leaving only a smooth metal surface where the handle had been. When they finished, room 33 had no external means of opening, just a keyhole and a door that could no longer be opened from outside. "Why? Remove the handle?" I asked. "Security modification," one of the maintenance workers replied. "Room's being converted to permanent storage." But that explanation made no sense. If room 33 was storage, why would removing the handle improve security? And if it was being converted, why hadn't I seen any equipment being moved in or out? The next morning, I checked with day shift about the maintenance work. No one had been informed about handle removal, no work orders had been filed, and no security modifications had been scheduled. Yet room 33's door now had no handle at all. The sounds from inside stopped completely after the handle removal. No movement, no impacts, no voices. Just silence that somehow felt more ominous than the mysterious activity I'd been hearing for months. I transferred to day shift in February, citing schedule conflicts, though the real reason was room 33. Night after night of hearing sounds I couldn't explain, seeing patients react to something staff denied existed, and watching a door gradually become more impossible to open. But sometimes, during quiet moments on day shift, I find myself looking toward the end of Ward A's corridor. Room 33 is still there, door still locked, window still covered from inside. And sometimes, just for a moment, I think I see patients standing there, listening to something only they can hear. Some doors, I've learned, are locked not to keep people out, but to keep something in. And some storage areas require more security than any hospital is willing to admit in their official policies. I am Dr. Margaret Chen, attending psychiatrist at Valley State Mental Health Facility. During my 12 years of practice, I've treated over 800 patients with conditions ranging from mild anxiety disorders to severe psychotic episodes. Each case requires careful documentation, proper diagnosis, and individualized treatment protocols that often take months or years to complete effectively. On September 15, 2019, I admitted a patient named David Kellerman following a psychiatric emergency evaluation. Mr. Kellerman, age 34, had been brought to our facility by police after a public disturbance involving claims that someone was living his life and demands that authorities arrest his replacement. Standard intake procedures revealed a man experiencing acute paranoid delusions with possible identity confusion. He insisted that another person had assumed his identity, was living in his apartment, working at his job, and maintaining relationships with his family members. Classic symptoms of Capgras syndrome, though unusually severe. "Doctor, you have to understand," Kellerman explained during our initial session. "I went to work Tuesday morning, everything normal. But when I came home, there was another me sitting at my kitchen table. Same face, same voice, wearing my clothes. He told me I was the fake one." I documented his statement in the medical record, noting the patient's genuine distress and his absolute conviction in the reality of his delusions. Capgras syndrome patients truly believe their loved ones have been replaced by identical imposters. In Kellerman's case, he believed he himself had been replaced. Treatment began with antipsychotic medication and daily therapy sessions focused on reality testing and cognitive behavioral techniques. Kellerman was cooperative but remained convinced of his story's truth, providing elaborate details about the encounter with his double. On October 3rd, 18 days into treatment, I received an emergency call from our admissions department. Police were bringing in a psychiatric emergency case, a man claiming someone had stolen his identity and was being treated at our facility under his name. "His name is David Kellerman," the intake coordinator reported. "Age 34, same physical description as our current patient. He's demanding to see whoever's impersonating him." I assumed this was a manifestation of Kellerman's delusions affecting family members or friends. Sometimes psychotic episodes can influence others who become convinced of the patient's false beliefs. But when I reviewed the intake paperwork, I found something that challenged my understanding of the entire case. The new admission had identical identification documents, same social security number, same driver's license information, same emergency contacts. But according to his story, he'd been missing for 18 days after being replaced by an imposter who was now receiving psychiatric treatment. "Dr. Chen," the second Kellerman said during our emergency evaluation, "the man you're treating stole my identity. I don't know how he got my documents, my memories, my face, but he's not me. I'm me." Both men were physically identical, same height, weight, facial features, scars, birthmarks. Both had comprehensive knowledge of David Kellerman's personal history, family relationships, work experiences, and childhood memories. Both insisted the other was an imposter. Both displayed genuine fear and confusion. I ordered immediate medical consultations, fingerprint analysis, dental records comparison, DNA sampling, and comprehensive physical examinations. If one man was an imposter, medical evidence would reveal the deception, but the results were impossible to interpret. Both men had identical fingerprints. Both matched the dental records on file for David Kellerman. Both possessed the same identifying marks: appendectomy scar, broken nose from childhood accident, distinctive birthmark on the left shoulder. The DNA samples were sent to an independent Laboratory for comparison. Results showed both men shared identical genetic markers. Not similar, identical, as if they were the same person tested twice. This has to be a laboratory error, I told Dr. Williams, our chief of staff. Two different people can't have identical DNA. Have you considered they might actually be identical twins? He suggested. Separated at birth, reunited under traumatic circumstances. I researched David Kellerman's birth records, interviewed family members, traced his personal history. No indication of twin birth, no gaps in his documented life story, no explanation for how two identical men could exist. Meanwhile, both patients remained convinced of their own authenticity and terrified of encountering each other. The original Kellerman claimed the newcomer was getting better at pretending to be me, and begged for protection from someone he insisted was stealing his identity. The second Kellerman maintained that the first was an imposter who had somehow assumed his life and was now being treated for mental illness that properly belonged to the fake person. "Doctor," he pleaded, "check my apartment, call my workplace, talk to my family. They'll confirm I'm the real David Kellerman. I did investigate." Kellerman's apartment was occupied by someone matching his description, who went to work daily at his registered employer, maintained relationships with friends and family members, and lived what appeared to be David Kellerman's normal life. But when I interviewed these contacts, their descriptions were consistent with both patients. Same personality traits, same mannerisms, same personal history details. The David Kellerman living independently was indistinguishable from either patient in our facility. Hospital policy required keeping the two men separated to prevent agitation or potential violence, but our facility wasn't designed to house identical patients with competing claims to the same identity. Staff began referring to them as Kellerman A and Kellerman B, though both objected to any designation that suggested they weren't the original. During individual therapy sessions, I attempted to identify distinguishing psychological characteristics that might reveal which man was experiencing delusions. But both demonstrated identical personality patterns, emotional responses, intellectual capacity, and memory access. More disturbing was how their conditions evolved in parallel. When Kellerman A showed improvement in reality testing, Kellerman B displayed identical progress. When one experienced setbacks or medication side effects, the other manifested the same symptoms simultaneously. By October 20th, both men had developed an obsessive focus on proving their authenticity. They requested polygraph tests, challenged each other to memory competitions, demanded meetings with childhood friends who could verify their identity. "One of us is lying," Kellerman A insisted. "One of us knows he's the fake. I just can't understand how he learned to imitate me so perfectly. He's getting my memories somehow," Kellerman B claimed. "Every session I have with you, he learns something new about being me. You have to stop treating him." I consulted with colleagues, reviewed psychiatric literature, searched for similar cases in medical journals. No documented instances of identical patients with competing identity claims. No treatment protocols for managing dual admissions of apparently the same person. The situation became more complex when both men began reporting identical dreams, experiencing the same physical symptoms, and developing similar behavioral changes. Their synchronization was so precise that medication adjustments for one patient produced identical effects in the other. On November 2nd, I made the decision to arrange a controlled meeting between the two patients. Perhaps direct confrontation would resolve the delusion, allow reality testing to function properly, and clarify which individual was experiencing psychotic symptoms. The meeting took place in our secure conference room, with adequate staff supervision and emergency protocols in place. Both men entered from opposite doors, saw each other clearly for the first time since admission. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. Both men began screaming simultaneously, identical expressions of horror and recognition. Not the confusion I'd expected from a patient seeing someone who resembled them, but the specific terror of someone confronting their own reflection in an impossible context. "That's me," they both said at exactly the same time, in identical voices, with identical inflection. The meeting lasted less than 30 seconds before both patients collapsed, showing signs of acute psychological shock. We provided immediate medical intervention, sedation, and returned them to separate rooms for observation. Both recovered physically within hours, but their psychological state had deteriorated significantly. Instead of resolving the identity confusion, the meeting had intensified their conviction that they were facing an imposter who had perfectly replicated their existence. "Doctor," Kellerman A. whispered during our next session, "what if we're both real? What if somehow there are two of me and neither of us is fake?" The same thought had occurred to me, though it challenged every principle of medical science I'd been trained to accept. On November 8th, I arrived at the hospital to find only one David Kellerman in our system. Not discharged, not transferred, simply one patient where there had been two the day before. Room 247, which had housed Kellerman B, was empty, with no record of occupancy. Administrative files showed only one admission for David Kellerman, dated September 15th. The remaining patient showed no memory of there ever being another version of himself. When I asked about his previous claims of imposter replacement, he looked confused. "Doctor, I think my medication is working. I don't remember being worried about identity theft. Was I having delusions about that?" I checked the medical records. Only one file existed for David Kellerman, comprehensive documentation of treatment for paranoid delusions involving identity confusion, with no mention of dual admissions or identical patients. But my personal notes contained detailed descriptions of both patients, careful documentation of their parallel symptoms, records of the failed meeting between them, evidence of a situation that apparently had never occurred, according to official hospital records. I questioned nursing staff about Kellerman B. No one remembered a second patient. The room assignment logs showed 247 had been vacant for weeks. Security footage from the period when both patients were present showed only one David Kellerman in our facility. Yet I had clear memories of treating two identical men, both convinced they were the original, both terrified of being replaced by someone who was indistinguishable from themselves. David Kellerman was discharged 3 weeks later, fully recovered from his paranoid delusions, ready to resume his normal life. But sometimes, during routine follow-up appointments, I notice him glancing around waiting areas as if looking for someone who should be there but isn't. Some patients, I've learned, recover from their delusions by integrating impossible experiences into a reality that can accommodate only one version of the truth. And some treatment outcomes can only be documented in notes that no official record will ever acknowledge existed. My name is James Rodriguez, and I worked as an orderly at Riverside Psychiatric Institute for 7 years. Night shift orderly duties involved patient monitoring, facility security, and maintaining the quiet environment essential for patient rest and recovery. The building's ventilation system was old but functional, installed in the 1970s with updates in the 1990s. Large metal ducts ran through ceiling spaces, carrying air between floors and wings. Standard HVAC design for institutional buildings, though the system produced occasional sounds, air movement, mechanical operation, thermal expansion. During my first year, these sounds were background noise I learned to ignore. But in March 2018, my rounds began including something unusual, voices coming from the ceiling ducts, muffled conversations, too indistinct to understand clearly, but recognizably human speech. The voices seemed to move through the ductwork, becoming audible in different locations as I walked the corridors. Professional-sounding discussions that suggested medical staff conducting consultations or reviewing cases. "Do you hear voices in the ventilation system?" I asked my supervisor during shift change. "Old building," he replied. "Sound carries through the ducts from other floors. Day shift conversations, late-night administrative work. Nothing unusual." That explanation seemed reasonable. Hospitals operate around the clock, and conversations in one area could travel through connected ductwork to distant locations. I accepted the voices as routine building acoustics and continued my standard duties. But over the following weeks, I began distinguishing words and phrases in the ceiling conversations. Medical terminology, patient names, treatment discussions. The content was specific, detailed, and often related to patients on my ward. Medication adjustment for room 23, I heard one night, clearly audible through the vent above the nurse's station. Increased dosage. Monitor for side effects. Room 23 housed Mrs. Patterson, who'd been experiencing medication compliance issues. The voice's recommendation made clinical sense, though I had no knowledge of any planned treatment changes. The next morning, I checked Mrs. Patterson's chart. New orders had been written. Medication increase, exactly as I'd heard discussed in the ceiling voices the night before. I started paying closer attention to the duct conversations, trying to understand who was speaking and where the discussions were taking place. The voices were too muffled for clear identification, but they demonstrated comprehensive knowledge of patient conditions, treatment protocols, and ongoing care plans. Room 17 requires psychiatric evaluation, I heard during my rounds in April. History of self-harm. Monitor closely. Room 17 was occupied by Mr. Chen, admitted for depression but showing no signs of self-destructive behavior. Yet the next day, his chart included new notations about self-harm risk and increased observation protocols. The pattern became consistent, ceiling voices discussing patient care, followed by chart entries that matched the overheard conversations, as if treatment decisions were being made in the ventilation system and later implemented by medical staff. But when I tried to trace the source of the voices, I found no explanation. The conversations occurred during night hours when minimal staff were present, in locations where no medical consultations were taking place. And the timing was wrong. I heard treatment discussions that preceded chart entries by hours or days. In May, something more disturbing began happening. Patients started responding to the ceiling voices. During my 2 a.m. rounds, I found Mr. Williams standing in his room looking up at the ceiling vent, apparently engaged in conversation with someone I couldn't see. "Yes, doctor," he was saying. "I understand the new medication schedule, twice daily with meals." But no, one was speaking. The vent was silent, at least to my ears. "Mr. Williams, who are you talking to?" He looked at me with confusion. "The doctor. He's explaining my treatment changes through the speaker system." There was no speaker system in patient rooms, no intercom connected to the ceiling vents. But Williams was clearly hearing something, responding to specific instructions about medical care. The next morning, his chart showed new medication orders. Twice daily dosing with meals, exactly as he discussed with the invisible voice. More patients began exhibiting similar behavior. Standing beneath ceiling vents, participating in one-sided conversations about their treatment, receiving detailed medical information from sources only they could hear. "The voice knows everything about me," Mrs. Garcia told me during medication distribution. My history, my symptoms, my family situation. Better than any doctor I've talked to. When I listened carefully at the ceiling vents where patients reported hearing voices, I detected only standard HVAC sounds. But the patients were clearly receiving accurate medical information from somewhere. I reported the phenomenon to the day shift supervisor. Several patients claim they're hearing medical consultations through the ceiling vents. They're getting treatment information that later appears in their charts. "Patients sometimes hallucinate voices," she replied. "It's common in psychiatric facilities. Document the incidents and note them in patient files. But the voices weren't random hallucinations. They provided accurate, specific, clinically appropriate information that consistently preceded official treatment decisions, and multiple patients were hearing similar content simultaneously." In June, I decided to investigate the ventilation system directly. During a quiet period around 3 a.m., I accessed the ceiling space through maintenance panels, bringing a flashlight and audio recorder to document whatever was happening in the ductwork. The ceiling space was standard institutional construction: metal ducts, insulation, electrical conduits, structural support beams. Nothing unusual, no equipment that could generate voices, no indication of hidden communication systems. But as I moved through the ductwork, I began hearing the voices clearly. Detailed medical discussions about patients throughout the facility, conducted by individuals I couldn't see. "Patient in room 31 requires dietary modification," one voice said. "Reduce sodium, monitor fluid intake, assess kidney function." The conversation was happening directly around me, but I was alone in the ceiling space. No speakers, no microphones, no source for the professional medical consultation I was hearing. I followed the voices through the ductwork, trying to locate their origin. But they seemed to move independently, shifting from one section to another, always just beyond the range of my flashlight. When I played back my audio recording the next morning, it contained only the sounds of my movement through the ceiling space. No voices, no medical discussions, no evidence of the conversations I'd heard clearly while making the recording. But the treatment recommendations I'd overheard were implemented throughout the facility. Room 31's patient received dietary modifications. Room 17's patient was started on kidney function monitoring. Room 8's patient was scheduled for the psychiatric evaluation I'd heard discussed in the ductwork. The facility's chief engineer agreed to inspect the ventilation system, looking for acoustic anomalies or unauthorized equipment. His assessment found standard HVAC operation, properly sealed ductwork, and no explanation for voice transmission through the system. Could voices from other areas of the building carry through the ducts? I asked. Not with this level of clarity, he replied, and definitely not with the specificity you're describing. Sound transmission through ductwork creates distortion, echo, loss of detail. But he did make one modification, sealing several vent openings where patients had reported hearing voices most frequently. Heavy-duty covers, industrial adhesive, permanent closure of access points between ceiling spaces and patient areas. The sealed vents had no effect on the phenomenon. Patients continued reporting detailed medical consultations coming from ceiling areas, even where ductwork had been completely blocked, and the information remained accurate, specific, and consistent with subsequent treatment decisions. By July, the pattern had become routine. Night shift reports of ceiling voices, patient interactions with invisible medical consultants, treatment recommendations that preceded official chart entries by days. I began keeping personal documentation of the voice phenomena, times, locations, overheard recommendations, subsequent chart changes. The correlation was undeniable. Whatever was happening in the ceiling spaces was directly influencing patient care throughout the facility. On July 23rd, I heard my own name in the ceiling discussions. "Orderly Rodriguez requires rest rotation," the voice said during my 4 a.m. rounds. "Excessive overtime, stress indicators, recommend schedule modification." The next week, my supervisor adjusted my work schedule, citing concern about overtime hours and the need for better work-life balance. But no one had discussed my schedule with me, and my supervisor claimed the decision was based on routine staff wellness protocols. The ceiling voices had somehow identified my work-related stress and influenced administrative decisions about my employment. Just as they'd been doing with patient care for months, I transferred to day shift in August, officially for family reasons, though the real motivation was avoiding the nightly conversations in the ventilation system. But even during day hours, I sometimes hear faint voices in ceiling spaces, discussing treatment plans, and making recommendations that later appear in official medical records. Some buildings, I've learned, develop their own approach to patient care, using communication systems that exist independently of installed equipment, and some treatment decisions are made by consultants who work exclusively in spaces between what's officially documented and what actually influences medical practice. I am Karen Walsh, charge nurse for the evening shift at Pinewood Mental Health Center. For 14 years, I've supervised patient care transitions between day and night shifts, ensuring continuity of treatment through detailed shift reports that document every significant change in patient status, medication administration, and behavioral observations. Shift reports are the foundation of psychiatric nursing. They provide essential information that allows incoming staff to understand each patient's current condition, ongoing concerns, and immediate care needs. Without accurate handover documentation, patient safety is compromised and treatment protocols break down. My standard procedure involved reviewing all patient records at the end of each shift, preparing comprehensive handover notes for night staff, and conducting verbal reports that highlighted critical issues requiring attention. This process typically took 30 to 45 minutes and resulted in detailed documentation that night shift nurses relied upon for safe patient care. On October 14, 2020, I completed my routine shift report as usual. 23 patients on our ward, each requiring specific notations about medication compliance, behavioral changes, family communications, and planned interventions. I documented everything meticulously, as I had every evening for over a decade. The handover meeting with night shift began at 11:00 p.m. I provided verbal summaries for each patient, referencing my written notes to ensure accuracy and completeness. Night nurse Thompson asked appropriate questions, clarified medication schedules, and acknowledged understanding of the critical issues I'd identified. Room 12 needs frequent checks, I reported. Mr. Patterson showed increased agitation this afternoon. Dr. Martinez wants hourly observations through the night. Room 18 refused evening medication, I continued. Mrs. Chen claims the pills make her dizzy. Need to contact Dr. Williams in the morning about dosage adjustment. Room 23 had family visit today. Daughter reports patient seems more confused lately. Recommend cognitive assessment when possible. Standard shift report content, covering all 23 patients with appropriate detail. Thompson took notes, asked follow-up questions, and confirmed she understood the care priorities for her shift. But when Thompson went to review my written shift report after our meeting, she couldn't find it. Karen, where did you put the handover notes? I'd left them in the standard location, clipboard at the nurse's station, clearly marked with the date and shift information. But the clipboard was empty except for blank forms. I definitely wrote the report, I insisted, checking other locations where the notes might have been placed. We just spent 20 minutes reviewing it together. Thompson helped me search the nurse's station, patient chart areas, and medication room. No sign of the written shift report, though we both had clear memories of discussing its contents in detail. Can you recreate it from memory? Thompson asked. I tried, but the details were already becoming fuzzy. Without my written notes for reference, I couldn't recall specific observations, medication times, or the particular concerns I'd documented about individual patients. Just work from the patient charts, I suggested. Everything important should be noted in the individual records. But when Thompson began her rounds, she discovered something more disturbing than missing paperwork. 3 patients were absent from their rooms. Room 12 was empty. No Mr. Patterson, no personal belongings, beds stripped and cleaned as if prepared for new occupancy. Room 18 showed no signs of Mrs. Chen, no clothing, no family photos, no indication anyone had been assigned to that space. Room 23 was vacant, with no trace of the patient whose family had visited earlier that day. Thompson checked the discharge, logs, transfer records, and administrative files. No documentation indicated these patients had been moved, discharged, or transferred to other facilities. According to official records, rooms 12, 18, and 23 had been unoccupied for weeks. Karen, you just gave me a report on 3 patients who apparently don't exist, Thompson said when she called me at home. Are you sure about the room numbers? I was certain. Mr. Patterson in room 12, Mrs. Chen in room 18, the confused patient in room 23 whose daughter had visited. I'd provided care for these individuals throughout my shift, documented their conditions, and reported their needs to night staff. But when I returned to the hospital the next morning, I found no evidence that these patients had ever been present. Their rooms were officially vacant. Their charts were missing from the filing system, and my colleagues had no memory of treating the individuals I'd described in my shift report. Patterson, Chen, and the patient in room 23. Day supervisor Martinez looked confused. Those rooms have been empty since our last discharge wave. You must be thinking of different patients. I checked my personal notes, medication administration records, and daily assignment sheets. No mention of the 3 patients. No indication. I'd provided care for anyone in rooms 12, 18, or 23. Yet I had clear memories of administering medications to Mr. Patterson, discussing dizziness concerns with Mrs. Chen, and observing cognitive changes in the room 23 patient whose daughter had expressed worry about increased confusion. Over the following days, I began questioning my memory of that evening shift. Had I actually cared for patients who didn't exist? Was I experiencing some form of stress-related confusion about my duties and responsibilities? But night nurse Thompson confirmed she'd received detailed verbal report about 3 patients who apparently had never been admitted to our facility. You gave me specific information about their conditions, medications, and care needs, she insisted. I took notes during our handover meeting, but when I checked on them, the rooms were empty. Thompson's notes from our meeting contained the same information I remembered discussing: Patterson's agitation requiring hourly checks, Chen's medication compliance issues, Room 23's cognitive concerns following family visit. But none of these patients existed in our system, and no documentation supported the treatment details we both remembered discussing. On October 19th, 5 days after the missing shift report incident, I found something that made my hands tremble: my original handover notes. Placed exactly where I'd left them, clipboard at the nurse's station, clearly marked with October 14th date and evening shift information. The same detailed documentation I'd written, covering all 23 patients with appropriate observations and care recommendations. But 3 entries had been added in handwriting I didn't recognize. Room 12, Patterson, Robert, discharged to family care, 10:14-11:30 p.m. Room 18, Chen, Margaret, transferred to medical unit, 10:14-11:45 p.m. Room 23, Thompson, Dorothy, expired, 10:15-12:03 a.m. The additional entries were written in blue ink, while my original notes used black. The handwriting was neat, professional, but definitely not mine. And the information contradicted what Thompson and I both remembered about these patients. Patterson hadn't been discharged. He'd required increased monitoring for agitation. Chen hadn't been transferred. She'd needed medication adjustment for dizziness. And I had no memory of anyone named Dorothy Thompson in room 23, let alone a patient who'd died during the night shift. More disturbing was the signature at the bottom of the revised report: Thompson, LRN, in handwriting that matched the added entries. But night nurse Thompson's first name was Jennifer, not L, and she insisted she'd never seen the handover notes until I found them 5 days after they'd gone missing. I didn't write those additional entries, Jennifer Thompson told me, when I showed her the report. And I didn't sign anything with the initial L. I contacted administration about the mysterious additions to my shift report. But when Supervisor Martinez reviewed the document, she saw only my original entries: 23 patients, standard observations, no additional notations about discharges, transfers, or deaths. The report looks normal, Karen. I don't see any unusual entries or unauthorized signatures. Yet Jennifer Thompson and I both saw the added information clearly: 3 patients with outcomes that explained their absence from the ward, signed by someone using Thompson's surname but the wrong first initial. I researched our staffing records, looking for any nurse named L. Thompson who might have worked at Pinewood. Found reference to Linda Thompson, RN, who'd been employed as night shift supervisor from 1987 to 1989. She died in a car accident in 1990, over 30 years before the mysterious entries appeared in my shift report. The additional entries remained, visible to Jennifer Thompson and me for 3 more days, then gradually faded until the report showed only my original documentation. But I kept photocopies that preserved the mysterious additions, evidence of information that appeared and disappeared independently of my memory or understanding. Since that October evening, I've been more careful about shift report documentation, creating duplicate copies and storing them securely. But sometimes I find additional entries in my notes, information about patient outcomes written in handwriting I don't recognize, signed by staff members who died decades before the events being documented. Some shift reports, I've learned, continue, being updated by nurses who understand that patient care doesn't end with employment termination. And some handover information comes from supervisors who remain committed to their duties long after their official responsibilities have been transferred to others. My name is Michael Stone, licensed architect with Stone & Associates Design. For 18 years, I've specialized in healthcare facility renovations, focusing on institutional buildings that require modernization while maintaining their therapeutic functionality. Psychiatric facilities present unique challenges. Patient safety, staff efficiency, and regulatory compliance must be balanced with creating environments that support mental health recovery. Westbrook Psychiatric Hospital contracted our firm to modernize their day treatment areas, specifically the main day room where patients spent significant portions of their daily routine. The space served multiple functions: group therapy, recreational activities, meals, and social interaction. Our renovation would update lighting, improve HVAC systems, and reconfigure furniture layouts for better patient flow. The day room was located on the first floor of the main building, a rectangular space measuring 40 feet by 60 feet according to the original 1962 architectural drawings. Standard institutional proportions for a room designed to accommodate 50 patients comfortably during peak usage periods. My initial site survey confirmed the blueprint dimensions, 40 by 60 feet, with 8 large windows along the south wall, 4 ceiling-mounted fluorescent light fixtures, and standard institutional finishes throughout. I documented existing conditions through photographs, measurements, and detailed notes that would guide our renovation planning. But when I returned for the detailed measurement phase 3 weeks later, my tape measure showed different dimensions: 47 feet by 73 feet. Not dramatically larger, but a 13-foot expansion that represented significant additional square footage. I assumed measurement error and repeated the process carefully. Same results: 47 by 73 feet, nearly 200 square feet. Larger than my initial survey. I checked my notes from the first visit, confirmed I'd measured the same space, and tried to understand the discrepancy. Perhaps I'd measured incorrectly during the initial survey, confused by furniture placement or poor lighting conditions. But my photographs from that visit clearly showed the room's proportions, and they appeared consistent with the original blueprints rather than my current measurements. I brought my senior designer, Patricia Wong, for a third measurement session. We used multiple methods: laser distance meters, traditional measuring tapes, and photogrammetry techniques that calculate dimensions from precisely positioned photographs. All methods confirmed the larger dimensions, 47 by 73 feet with 10 windows, along the south wall instead of the 8 shown in blueprints in my initial photographs. The blueprints must be inaccurate, Patricia suggested. Buildings are often modified without updating the architectural drawings. The current dimensions are probably correct. That seemed reasonable. Institutional buildings undergo constant modifications, and documentation doesn't always reflect actual conditions. But I'd worked in hundreds of similar facilities, and I'd never encountered measurement discrepancies this significant without obvious signs of renovation. We proceeded with design development based on the measured dimensions: 47 by 73 feet, 10 windows, updated furniture layouts that accommodated the larger space. Our renovation plans included electrical improvements, HVAC modifications, and accessibility upgrades scaled to the room's actual size. But when I returned for the construction phase kickoff meeting, the day room measured 52 feet by 78 feet. 5 feet longer, 5 feet wider, with 12 windows along the south wall. The room had grown again, and my most recent measurements were now obsolete. Mr. Stone, the hospital administrator, said, "Are you having trouble with your measuring equipment? The construction crew needs accurate dimensions to order materials and plan their work." I couldn't explain what was happening. 3 separate measurement sessions had produced 3 different results, each showing the day room larger than the previous survey. And the changes weren't subtle. We were documenting significant expansions that should have been impossible without major construction work. I brought different equipment: 2 separate laser measuring devices, traditional steel measuring tapes, and a surveyor's wheel for verification. All instruments confirmed the new dimensions: 52 by 78 feet. More puzzling was the window count. My photographs from the initial survey clearly showed 8 windows. Current count was 12. But there was no evidence of construction work, no signs that new windows had been installed or wall sections modified. The construction supervisor reviewed our renovation plans, noting that material orders were based on dimensions that no longer matched the actual space. "You're going to need more electrical fixtures, additional HVAC capacity, and a lot more flooring material," he observed. "This room is significantly larger than your drawings indicate." We revised our plans based on the current measurements, ordered additional materials, and began construction with specifications that matched the observed dimensions. But I remained troubled by the measurement inconsistencies and the apparent impossibility of spontaneous room expansion. Patricia suggested we monitor the space over time, taking regular measurements to determine if the dimensions were stable or continuing to change. Maybe there's some kind of structural settling or foundation movement that's affecting our readings, she theorized. We established a measurement protocol. Weekly surveys using multiple instruments, photographs from consistent positions, and detailed documentation of any observed changes. If the room was somehow expanding, we needed to understand the mechanism and its implications for construction planning. The weekly measurements revealed a pattern that challenged architectural principles. The day room was growing consistently, approximately 2 feet in each direction per month. Week 1, 52 by 78 feet, 12 windows. Week 2, 53 by 79 feet, 12 windows. Week 3, 54 by 81 feet, 13 windows. Week 4, 56 by 82 feet, 13 windows. Not only was the room expanding, but architectural features were changing to accommodate the larger space. Additional windows appeared without construction work, lighting fixtures multiplied to provide appropriate illumination, and the floor plan reconfigured itself to maintain proper proportions. He contacted structural engineers, building inspectors, and surveying specialists. No one had encountered similar phenomena, and no technical explanations could account for spontaneous room expansion. Buildings don't grow, the structural engineer told me bluntly. You're dealing with measurement errors, equipment malfunctions, or documentation problems. Rooms have fixed dimensions determined by their structural boundaries. But hospital staff began reporting experiences that supported my measurements. Patients complained that the day room felt too big, that it took longer to walk from one end to the other, that they sometimes felt lost in a space that had previously been familiar. The room feels endless now, one patient told the nursing staff. I start walking toward the windows, but I never seem to get there. Night shift security guards reported similar observations during their rounds. The day room seems larger at night, Officer Martinez noted. Takes more time to walk through, more area to check. Like the walls moved back when nobody was looking. Began conducting measurements at different times of day, wondering if lighting conditions or visual perception might be affecting our readings. But the expansion appeared consistent regardless of when we surveyed the space. By December, the day room measured 67 by 89 feet according to our instruments, significantly larger than the gymnasium in the hospital's recreation wing. But the expansion had occurred gradually enough that most staff hadn't noticed the change. Construction work became increasingly complex as we tried to renovate a space that kept changing size. Electrical runs designed for specific dimensions required constant adjustment. HVAC calculations needed revision as the room's volume increased. Flooring orders were never quite sufficient for the expanding area. Mr. Stone, the construction supervisor, said, "We can't complete this project if the room keeps growing. Every time we install something, the dimensions change and our work no longer fits properly." I understood his frustration, but I had no explanation for the phenomenon we were documenting. The day room was expanding according to every measurement method we used, but the process violated basic principles of structural engineering. On December 15th, I decided to conduct a continuous measurement session, positioning myself in the day room overnight to observe any changes in real time. At 11 p.m., the room measured 69 by 91 feet. I set up laser measuring equipment at fixed points, marked reference positions on the floor, and prepared to document any expansion that occurred during the night. At 3 a.m., I repeated the measurements. 71 by 93 feet. The room had grown 2 feet in each direction during 4 hours of direct observation, though I hadn't seen any visible movement or structural change. I walked the perimeter, checking walls for signs of movement. Solid, unchanged, no indication of construction or modification. But the measurements were undeniable. The space had expanded while I was watching. At 6 a.m., when day shift staff arrived, the day room measured 73 by 95 feet, nearly double the original blueprint dimensions, with 18 windows along the south wall instead of the original 8. But when I showed the measurements to hospital administration, they expressed confusion about my documentation. "Mr. Stone, our day room has always been this size," the administrator said. "The blueprints you're referencing must be for a different building. This space has measured 73 by 95 feet since construction." I checked the architectural drawings again. They now showed 73 by 95 feet, matching my current measurements. but I had clear memories of original blueprints indicating 40 by 60 feet, and photographs that documented a much smaller space. The renovation was completed using the final measurements, though the project required twice the materials and labor originally budgeted. But none of the hospital staff seemed to remember the day room being smaller, and no one questioned why our renovation costs had doubled. Sometimes I return to Westbrook to observe the completed day room, wondering if the expansion has continued. The space feels appropriately sized for its current function, with no indication it was ever smaller. But I keep my original photographs and measurement notes as evidence of a renovation project that grew larger than the building it was supposed to improve. Some spaces, I've learned, expand to accommodate the activities they house, growing beyond their original architectural constraints to provide whatever dimensions are needed for proper function. And some buildings understand their purpose better than the blueprints that were supposed to define their limits. My name is Susan Martinez, and I was a psychiatric social worker at Riverside State Hospital for 9 years. My responsibilities included discharge planning, family coordination, and community integration support for patients transitioning from institutional care to independent living. Successful discharges required careful preparation, comprehensive planning, and ongoing follow-up to ensure patients maintain their progress in less structured environments. One of my most challenging cases was Robert Henley, a 54-year-old man who'd been hospitalized for severe bipolar disorder with psychotic features. He'd been admitted in 2016 following a manic episode that resulted in property damage, public disturbance, and emergency psychiatric evaluation. His condition required intensive treatment, medication stabilization, and extensive therapy to address the underlying psychological issues that had led to his hospitalization. Robert's early treatment was complicated by medication resistance, frequent mood cycling, and difficulty accepting his diagnosis. He spent his first 18 months alternating between periods of deep depression and manic episodes that required seclusion and intensive monitoring. His family visited regularly but expressed concern about their ability to provide appropriate care if he were discharged. By late 2018, Robert began showing significant improvement. His medications were finally optimized, his mood episodes became less frequent and less severe, and he participated actively in therapy sessions and group activities. Dr. Williams, his attending psychiatrist, noted consistent progress and began discussing discharge planning. I worked with Robert for 6 months, preparing for his return to community living. We identified suitable housing options, arranged outpatient mental health services, coordinated with social services for ongoing support, and developed comprehensive plans that would help him maintain his stability after discharge. His family was initially hesitant but agreed to provide support during his transition. We conducted family therapy sessions, educated them about his condition and medication needs, and established clear protocols for managing any signs of relapse. By June 2019, Robert met all criteria for discharge: stable mental status, medication compliance, family support, housing arrangements, and outpatient treatment plan. Dr. Williams cleared him medically, administration approved the discharge, and we scheduled his departure for June 15th. The discharge process went smoothly. Robert packed his belongings, said goodbye to staff and other patients, and expressed gratitude for the care he'd received. His brother arrived to pick him up, signed the necessary papers, and we completed all documentation required for successful discharge. I watched from the social work office window as Robert and his brother loaded personal items into the car. Standard discharge scene. Patient walking to the parking lot, getting into the vehicle, driving away to begin the next phase of recovery. But 3 days later, Night Security Officer Davis reported seeing Robert walking the hospital grounds during his evening rounds. "Ms. Martinez, wasn't Robert Henley discharged earlier this week? I saw him by the main entrance around midnight. Still wearing hospital clothes, carrying what looked like a packed suitcase." I checked Robert's file. Discharged successfully on June 15th, transported by family member, all paperwork completed appropriately. But Davis insisted he'd seen Robert on hospital property well after his documented departure. "Are you sure it was Robert?" I asked. Long-term patients sometimes look similar, especially in dim lighting. Definitely Robert, Davis replied. I talked with him regularly during his stay, recognized him immediately. I contacted Robert's brother to verify he'd arrived home safely. The brother confirmed Robert had been picked up as scheduled, driven to his new apartment, and helped with settling in. No problems, no indication of confusion or desire to return to the hospital. But Davis continued reporting sightings of Robert on hospital grounds. Walking near the main building, sitting on benches in the courtyard, standing by the windows of his former room, always carrying the same suitcase, always wearing the same clothes he'd worn on discharge day. Other security guards began reporting similar observations. Robert appeared regularly during evening hours, walked familiar paths around the hospital grounds, and seemed to be attempting to re-enter the building through locked doors. Mr. Henley appears confused about his discharge, Officer Chen observed. He keeps trying door handles, looking through windows, as if he doesn't understand why he can't come back inside. I reviewed Robert's discharge plan, wondering if we'd missed signs of anxiety about leaving the hospital. Some long-term patients develop institutional dependency and struggle with the transition to independent living. Perhaps Robert was having difficulty adjusting and returning to familiar surroundings for comfort. But when I called his outpatient therapist, she reported that Robert was adjusting well to community living, attending appointments regularly, taking medications as prescribed, participating in day program activities. No signs of distress, no desire to return to inpatient care. Robert's doing remarkably well, she told me. He mentions missing some aspects of hospital routine, but he's clearly benefiting from increased independence and community engagement. Yet hospital security continued documenting Robert's presence on the grounds. Night after night, walking the same paths, carrying the same suitcase, wearing the same discharge clothes. I decided to observe the phenomenon myself. On July 3rd, I stayed late and positioned myself where I could see the main entrance and courtyard areas. At approximately 11:30 p.m., I saw Robert clearly, walking slowly along the main pathway, carrying a brown suitcase, wearing the blue shirt and khaki pants he'd worn on discharge day. He moved purposefully, but without apparent destination, following routes he'd taken during his 3-year hospitalization. I went outside to speak with him. "Robert, what are you doing here?" He looked at me with recognition but no surprise. "Ms. Martinez, I'm trying to go home, but I think I'm lost." "Robert, you were discharged 2 weeks ago. Your home is an apartment across town. Your brother helped you move in." He looked confused. "I remember packing my things, but I can't seem to leave. Every time I try to go, I end up back here." I walked with him toward the parking area, intending to help him contact his brother or arrange transportation to his apartment. But as we approached the hospital's main entrance, Robert stopped abruptly. "I can't go any further," he said. "Something's keeping me here." I looked around. No physical barriers, no security personnel preventing his departure. But Robert seemed genuinely unable to continue walking away from the building. "Would you like me to call your brother? He can come pick you up." "I've been trying to call him for weeks," Robert replied. "But my phone doesn't work here anymore." He showed me an old cell phone, standard model that should have functioned normally. But when I tried using it, I got no signal, no dial tone, no response from the device. I offered to let him use my phone, but when Robert tried calling his brother's number, the call wouldn't connect. My phone showed full signal strength, but attempts to reach Robert's family resulted in error messages and failed connections. The next morning, I contacted Robert's outpatient therapist again, describing the previous night's encounter. She remained confused about my report. "Susan, Robert had his appointment yesterday afternoon. He seemed fine. No mention of visiting the hospital or having transportation problems." "Are you sure you spoke with him?" I was certain. Clear conversation, recognition, detailed discussion about his discharge and current living situation. But according to his treatment providers, Robert was adjusting well to community life and showing no signs of distress. I began documenting the nighttime encounters, creating detailed notes about Robert's appearances on hospital grounds. Always the same time range, same clothing, same suitcase, same confusion about his inability to leave. Other staff members reported similar interactions. Night nurses saw him through windows, trying to enter his former room. Kitchen staff noticed him in the cafeteria area, apparently looking for meals. Maintenance workers found him in corridors he'd used during his hospitalization. Each encounter followed the same pattern. Robert appeared confused about his discharge, expressed desire to go home, but seemed unable to leave hospital property despite no physical restrictions preventing his departure. On July 15th, exactly 1 month after his discharge, I decided to accompany Robert to his apartment, thinking that visiting his new home might resolve whatever was causing his confusion. We walked to my car in the hospital parking lot. Robert got in without difficulty, buckled his seatbelt, and provided directions to his apartment complex. Normal behavior, clear thinking, no indication of psychological distress. But as I drove away from the hospital, Robert began showing signs of agitation. "Ms. Martinez, I think we're going the wrong way. Home is back there." He pointed toward the hospital building. "Robert, your apartment is across town. We arranged everything before your discharge. You've been living there for a month." "I don't remember an apartment," he said, growing more distressed. "I remember packing, getting ready to leave, but then nothing, just trying to find my way home every night." As we reached the halfway point between hospital and apartment, Robert's distress became acute, breathing rapidly, perspiring, showing signs of panic that I'd never observed during his hospitalization. "Please take me back," he pleaded. "Something's wrong. I don't think I'm supposed to be this far away." I returned to the hospital where Robert's symptoms subsided immediately upon re-entering the parking area. He thanked me for the ride, took his suitcase from my car, and walked back toward the main building. The next morning I called Robert's apartment. His brother answered, reporting that Robert was doing well, attending his day program, and showing continued improvement in his mental health. No mention of nighttime visits to the hospital, no awareness of any problems with his discharge transition. Yet hospital security continued documenting Robert's presence on the grounds, every night, carrying the same suitcase, wearing the same clothes, unable to complete his departure despite being officially discharged with successful outcomes. I've since transferred to a different facility, but I sometimes drive past Riverside during evening hours. Robert is still there, walking the familiar paths, carrying his packed belongings, perpetually in the process of leaving but never quite able to complete his journey home. Some discharges, I've learned, are successful on paper but incomplete in reality. And some patients require a different kind of follow-up care that extends beyond the boundaries of official documentation and community-based treatment programs. My name is Thomas Chen, and I worked night security at Millfield Psychiatric Hospital for 8 years. Hospital security requires vigilance, attention to detail, and meticulous documentation of all activities during 12-hour shifts. Patient safety, staff protection, and facility security depend on guards who understand that psychiatric hospitals present unique challenges requiring specialized training and careful observation. My duties included hourly rounds of all patient areas, monitoring of security systems, maintaining visitor logs, and completing detailed incident reports for any unusual occurrences. The job demanded physical stamina, mental alertness, and the ability to de-escalate potentially dangerous situations involving patients experiencing acute psychological distress. Most importantly, security work required comprehensive documentation. Every round, every observation, every interaction had to be logged with precise timestamps and detailed descriptions. State regulations mandated these records, insurance companies required them for liability purposes, and administration used them to assess security effectiveness and identify areas needing improvement. I maintained my security logs with professional precision. Each entry included exact times, locations checked, conditions observed, and any actions taken. My handwriting was clear, my observations were objective, and my documentation met the highest standards of security professionalism. For 7 years, my logs reflected routine hospital operations, quiet corridors, secure doors, sleeping patients, minimal incidents requiring intervention. The work was often monotonous. but the documentation was essential for maintaining the comprehensive records that protected both patients and staff. But during my final year at Millfield, I began finding additional entries in my security logs, observations I didn't remember making, rounds I hadn't walked, signatures that looked like mine but documented activities I hadn't performed. The first anomalous entry appeared on March 3, 2021, during what should have been a routine night shift. My standard log showed normal hourly rounds from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m., each entry properly timed and appropriately detailed. But at the bottom of the page, I found an additional entry, 3:47 a.m., final round complete, all areas secure. End of watch. T. Chen. The handwriting looked like mine. The signature matched my usual style, but I had no memory of making a 3:47 a.m. entry. According to my recollection and the previous entries, my final round had been completed at 3:00 a.m., with no subsequent patrol activities. More puzzling was the phrase end of watch, terminology I'd never used in my security logs. My standard entries concluded with round complete or all secure, never the formal finality of end of watch. I assumed I'd made the entry automatically, perhaps during a moment of fatigue when my memory wasn't functioning clearly. Night shift. Work can be exhausting, and guards sometimes perform routine tasks without clear conscious awareness, but the additional entries continued appearing, always following the same pattern. Extra rounds documented after my final official patrol, signed, with my name, concluding with end of watch, March 8th, 4:23 a.m., patrol complete, building secure, end of watch. T-Chen, March 15th, 4:01 a.m., all areas checked, no incidents, end of watch. T-Chen, March 22nd, 4:35 a.m., final security sweep complete, end of watch. T-Chen each. Entry was written in handwriting that appeared to be mine, but the times indicated rounds I hadn't walked. I was always in the security office by 3:30 a.m., completing paperwork and preparing for shift change. I wasn't conducting additional patrols in the 4 a.m. hour. I began paying closer attention to my activities during the final hours of each shift, trying to identify when I might be making these mysterious entries. But I remained consistently in the security office from 3:30 a.m. until shift change at 7 a.m., with no memory of additional patrol duties. The entries weren't random. They described specific security activities, checking patient rooms, testing, doctor locks, verifying alarm systems, observing sleeping patients. Detailed observations that suggested comprehensive patrols of the entire facility. March 29th, 4:18 a.m. Ward A secure, all patients accounted for. Ward B quiet, no disturbances. Administration wing locked, systems operational, end of watch. T-Chen, but I wasn't conducting these extensive patrols. My final official round ended by 3 a.m. and I spent the remaining shift hours completing documentation and monitoring security systems from the central office. I considered the possibility that I was sleepwalking or experiencing some form of dissociative episode that allowed me to perform complex tasks without conscious memory. But sleepwalking doesn't typically involve detailed writing, and dissociative states rarely produce comprehensive documentation. In April, I decided to test my theory by remaining in the security office continuously from 3 a.m. until shift change, forcing myself to stay awake and aware of my activities. On April 5th, I completed my final official round at 2:58 a.m., returned to the office, and remained at my desk until morning shift arrived. I read incident reports, reviewed security protocols, and maintained constant awareness of my location and activities. But the next morning, I found the familiar additional entry in my log. 22 a.m., complete facility check. All areas secure. Patient. Welfare confirmed. End of watch. T-Chen. The entry was written in my handwriting, documenting a comprehensive patrol that I definitely hadn't performed. I'd been sitting at my desk continuously, never leaving the office after 3 a.m., yet the observation details were accurate. The entry mentioned a broken window in Ward C that I'd reported during my official round, a malfunctioning light fixture in the administration wing that maintenance had noted, and specific patient behaviors I'd observed earlier in the evening. How? Could I write detailed, accurate observations about facility conditions while sitting in an office several hundred feet away from the areas being described? I brought a digital camera to work, setting it up to record my activities during the final hours of my shift. If I was somehow leaving the office and conducting additional patrols without conscious memory, the camera would document my movements. The recording showed me sitting at my desk continuously from 3 a.m. until shift change. Reading, writing, occasionally standing to stretch, but never leaving the office. Yet my security log contained the same additional entry, documenting rounds I clearly hadn't walked. April 12th, 4:31 a.m. Full building patrol complete. Security systems functioning. All personnel accounted for. End of watch. Teach and I showed. The recording today shift supervisor Martinez, explaining the discrepancy between my documented activities and my actual location. "Tom, you're making these entries yourself," he said after reviewing the footage. "The handwriting is clearly yours. The signature matches your style. Maybe you're just tired and don't remember writing them." But I was becoming increasingly certain that someone else was making the entries, using handwriting that somehow matched mine perfectly. The phenomenon intensified in May. Not only were additional entries appearing in my logs, but they were becoming more detailed and more specific about facility conditions I couldn't have observed. May 3rd, 4:17 a.m., patient in room 23 showing signs of distress, monitored until stable. Ward B ventilation system operational. Kitchen area secure, no unauthorized access. End of watch. Teach and I checked on the room 23 patient during my next shift. Nursing staff confirmed he'd experienced anxiety during the night, required additional medication, and had been monitored closely until morning. But I hadn't observed this incident, hadn't been present in Ward B during the time frame indicated in my log. The entries were documenting real events with perfect accuracy, written in my handwriting, but describing observations I hadn't made. Into June, I requested a meeting with hospital administration, presenting the accumulated evidence of mysterious log entries that appeared under my name, but documented activities I hadn't performed. "Mr. Chen," Administrator Williams said, "these logs show exemplary security work, detailed observations, comprehensive patrols, thorough documentation. Your performance has been outstanding, but I'm not making these entries," I insisted. "Someone else is using my name to document security activities." Williams reviewed several months of logs, noting the consistent pattern of comprehensive final patrols concluding with end of watch. "These entries demonstrate exactly the kind of thorough security work we expect from our night shift guards," he said. "Your documentation shows attention to detail and commitment to patient safety that reflects well on our security department." He couldn't understand my objection to entries that made my performance appear exemplary. But I knew I wasn't making these observations, wasn't conducting these final patrols, and wasn't using the formal end-of-watch terminology. On July 15th, my final night at Millfield, I completed my last official security log, standard entries documenting hourly rounds, routine observations, no unusual incidents. But when I checked the log before leaving, I found one final additional entry. AM, patrol duties transferred, all areas secure, facility protection maintained, final end of watch. T. Chen. The entry was dated for the shift after my departure, written in handwriting that matched mine, but documenting a transition I wouldn't be present to make. I left Millfield that morning and never returned. Found work at a corporate security firm where the documentation was simpler and the responsibilities were more clearly defined. But sometimes I wonder who's maintaining the detailed security logs at Millfield, documenting the comprehensive patrols that ensure patient safety through the long night hours. Some duties, I've learned, require guards who understand that protection extends beyond scheduled shifts and official employment. And some security work is performed by officers who take their responsibilities seriously enough to continue their watch long after their official duties have ended. I am Dr. Patricia Holloway, licensed clinical psychologist with 16 years of experience in psychiatric hospital settings. My specialty involves therapeutic interventions for patients experiencing severe dissociative disorders, identity confusion, and reality testing difficulties. These conditions often require innovative treatment approaches that help patients reconnect with their sense of self and distinguish between internal experiences and external reality. At Clearwater State Hospital, we utilized various grounding techniques to help patients with dissociative episodes regain awareness of their physical presence and immediate environment. One particularly effective method involved mirror therapy, having patients observe their reflections while discussing their thoughts, feelings, and perceptions with trained clinical staff. The therapy room contained a large mirror mounted on the wall, positioned so patients could see themselves clearly while sitting in comfortable chairs during session. The mirror served multiple purposes, helping patients recognize their physical self, providing reality anchoring during dissociative episodes, and allowing clinicians to observe patient reactions to their own appearance. For 3 years, mirror therapy produced consistently positive results. Patients with depersonalization disorders reported feeling more connected to their bodies after viewing their reflections. Those experiencing identity confusion found the visual feedback helpful for maintaining sense of self during therapeutic discussions. But in October 2019, patients began reporting unusual observations about their reflections in the therapy room. Mirror. "Doctor, that's not my face," patient Morrison told me during our session. "I mean, it looks like me, but something's wrong with the eyes." I observed Morrison's reflection carefully. Normal appearance, appropriate facial expressions, no obvious distortions or anomalies. But Morrison seemed genuinely disturbed by what he saw in the mirror. "What specifically concerns you about your reflection?" I asked. "The person in the mirror knows things I don't know," he replied. "I can see it in the expression, like he's keeping secrets from me." This response wasn't unusual for patients with dissociative disorders. Mirror confrontation often produces anxiety, identity confusion, or projection of internal conflicts onto reflected images. I documented Morrison's reaction and continued with standard therapeutic protocols. But over the following weeks, multiple patients reported similar disturbances about their mirror reflections. Complaints that their reflection looked different, moved independently, or displayed expressions that didn't match their actual emotions. "My reflection smiled when I was crying," patient Davis reported during her session. "I touched my face to make sure I wasn't smiling, but the mirror person kept smiling anyway." I began paying closer attention to patient reactions during mirror therapy sessions, looking for patterns that might indicate shared psychological phenomena or environmental factors affecting their perceptions. What I observed troubled me deeply. During patient Williams' session on November 15th, I noticed something that challenged my understanding of reflection physics. As Williams gestured with his right hand, his reflection appeared to move the left hand first, creating a brief delay that violated the normal simultaneity of mirror images. I attributed this to visual processing errors or fatigue-related perception problems. But when I mentioned the observation to Williams, he became agitated. "You see it too," he exclaimed. "The mirror person doesn't move at the same time I do. Sometimes he moves first, like he knows what I'm going to do before I do it." I couldn't scientifically confirm Williams's perception, but I'd observed something that didn't align with normal mirror reflection behavior. During the following session, I positioned myself where I could observe both Williams and his reflection simultaneously. The delayed movement occurred again, Williams' actual gesture followed by his reflection's movement approximately half a second later. But when I looked directly at the mirror, the reflection appeared normal. Only in my peripheral vision could I detect the timing discrepancy that both Williams and I had observed. I consulted with Dr. Martinez about the mirror therapy observations, describing the patient reports and my own perceptual anomalies. "Patricia, patients with dissociative disorders often project internal conflicts onto external objects," he replied. "The mirror becomes a convenient target for their identity confusion. As for your own observations, you're probably unconsciously influenced by their suggestions." That explanation seemed reasonable. Suggestion and confirmation bias could account for my perception of reflection abnormalities. But patient reports continued, and they were becoming more specific and more disturbing. "Doctor, there's a woman standing behind you in the mirror," patient Chen told me during our December 3rd session. "She's wearing a nurse's uniform, but she looks very old-fashioned." I turned to look behind me. No one there. But when I faced the mirror again, Chen continued staring at the reflection with evident fear. "She's still there," Chen whispered. "She's trying to say something, but I can't hear her." I saw nothing unusual in the mirror, just Chen and myself. Normal reflections in appropriate positions. But Chen's terror was genuine, and her description was remarkably specific. After the session, I researched Clearwater's history, looking for any deceased staff members who might match Chen's description. Found records of Nurse Margaret Stevens, who'd worked at the hospital from 1967 to 1983, died in 1991. Historical photographs showed her wearing the style of uniform Chen had described, but there was no reason for Chen to know about Nurse Stevens. No way she could have accessed historical information about deceased staff members. During subsequent sessions, patients reported seeing various figures in the mirror that weren't visible in the actual room. Always healthcare workers, always wearing outdated uniforms or clothing, always attempting to communicate something that patients couldn't understand. "The old doctor keeps pointing at my chart," patient Rodriguez observed. "He looks worried about something, but he can't tell me what's wrong." "There's a woman in a white coat standing next to you," patient Thompson reported. "She's shaking her head like she disagrees with what you're saying." I began documenting these reports systematically, noting descriptions, apparent time periods of the clothing, and any identifying characteristics patients could provide. The figures consistently matched historical staff members who'd worked at Clearwater decades earlier. On January 8, 2020, I experienced something that fundamentally changed my understanding of the mirror therapy situation. During patient Anderson's session, I glanced at the mirror and saw my own reflection clearly. But standing behind me was a figure I recognized from hospital historical photographs. Dr. James Harrison, who'd been chief of psychiatry at Clearwater from 1971 to 1985, deceased since 1994. Dr. Harrison appeared to be observing our session, taking notes on a clipboard, occasionally nodding or shaking his head in response to my therapeutic interventions. He was clearly visible in the mirror, though no one was standing behind me in the actual room. I tried to continue the session professionally, but Anderson noticed my distraction. "You see him too, don't you, doctor? The man with the clipboard?" I couldn't deny what I was observing. Dr. Harrison's reflection was as clear as my own, showing details I couldn't possibly have imagined. Specific facial expressions, period-appropriate. Clothing, vintage clipboard that matched historical photographs I'd seen in hospital archives. When I looked directly behind me, I saw nothing. But in the mirror, Dr. Harrison continued observing our session, occasionally making notes that seemed to evaluate my therapeutic techniques. The session ended early. I couldn't maintain professional composure while being observed by the reflection of a psychiatrist who'd been dead for over 25 years. I reported the incident to hospital administration, recommending immediate inspection of the therapy room mirror for potential safety hazards or environmental factors that might be causing visual disturbances. But Maintenance Supervisor Williams found nothing unusual about the mirror itself. Standard reflective glass, properly mounted, no structural defects or optical abnormalities that could account for the reported phenomena. "Maybe you need a different mirror," he suggested. "This one's been here since the building opened in 1965. Could be showing some age-related problems." But when I researched the mirror's history, I discovered something that made my hands shake. The mirror had been donated to Clearwater in 1965 by the family of Dr. Margaret Whitman, the hospital's first psychiatrist, who died unexpectedly during the facility's construction phase. According to the dedication plaque that had been removed during renovations, the mirror was intended to help patients see themselves clearly and find the strength to face their true reflection. But Dr. Whitman had died before ever using the mirror for patient therapy. The therapeutic tool she'd envisioned had been installed and used for decades by psychiatrists who'd come after her. On February 14th, during what would be my final mirror therapy session, the mirror cracked. Not from impact or structural stress, spontaneous. Fracture that appeared while patient Davis was observing her reflection. A diagonal crack extending from upper left to lower right, dividing the reflective surface into two triangular sections. But both Davis and I could see that our reflections remained whole and undistorted, despite the physical crack in the mirror. The fracture was visible in the glass itself, but didn't affect the reflected images. "Doctor," Davis said quietly, "the people behind you are leaving now. They look sad." I saw them too, in my final clear view of the mirror's reflection. Dozens of healthcare workers in period clothing from different eras, all apparently observing our session, all beginning to fade as the cracks spread across the mirror's surface. Dr. Harrison was the last to disappear, nodding respectfully in my direction before his reflection vanished entirely. The cracked mirror remains in the therapy room, though it's no longer used for patient sessions. Administration deemed it a safety hazard due to the fracture, but no one has been assigned to remove or replace it. Sometimes, when I pass the room during routine hospital visits, I notice staff members standing in the doorway, looking at the broken mirror with expressions of curiosity mixed with reluctance to enter. Some therapeutic tools, I've learned, retain the intentions of those who created them, continuing to provide supervision and guidance long after their original practitioners have moved beyond the reach of standard professional consultation. My name is Lisa Chang, and I was a night shift nurse at Maplewood Psychiatric Hospital for 6 years. Night nursing in a psychiatric facility requires constant alertness to patient needs, emergency situations, and the various medical crises that can develop during hours when staffing is minimal and resources are limited. The nurse call system was our primary communication link with patients during night shifts. Each room had a call button that activated a light at the nurse's station and produced an audible alert when patients needed assistance. Simple technology, but essential for patient safety and rapid response to medical emergencies. Room 12 housed Mr. Davidson, a 67-year-old man admitted for severe depression with suicidal ideation. He'd been hospitalized for 3 weeks, receiving medication adjustments and intensive therapy to address the psychological issues that had led to his admission. Davidson was generally cooperative, rarely used his call button, and required standard monitoring for patients with his diagnosis. On January 18, 2020, during my routine night shift, Room 12's call light began blinking at 11:47 p.m. Standard. Procedure required immediate response to all patient calls, particularly from patients with mental health conditions that might indicate medical or psychological emergencies. I went to Room 12 expecting to find Davidson requesting medication, bathroom assistance, or expressing anxiety common among patients with depression. But when I entered the room, I found it empty. Not just unoccupied, completely empty. No patient, no personal belongings, no indication that anyone had been assigned to the room. The bed was stripped down to the mattress, medical equipment had been removed, and the space appeared prepared for deep cleaning. But the call light continued blinking, both in the room and at the nurse's station. I checked the patient roster and room assignments. According to official records, Room 12 had been vacant for 2 weeks, with no patient assigned since the previous occupant had been discharged on January 4th. Yet I had clear memories of caring for Mr. Davidson in Room 12 throughout my recent shifts. Medication administration, routine monitoring, brief conversations about his treatment progress. But according to hospital records, no patient named Davidson had been admitted during the past month. I pressed the call button in Room 12, attempting to reset the system and stop the blinking light. The button clicked normally, but the light continued flashing with steady persistence. I contacted maintenance, reporting a malfunctioning call system in Room 12. Maintenance worker Rodriguez arrived within 30 minutes, bringing standard electrical, testing equipment and replacement parts for call button systems. "Probably just a stuck switch or loose wiring," he said, examining the call button assembly. "These old systems develop problems over time." Rodriguez tested the electrical connections, replaced the call button mechanism, and verified that the system was functioning properly. But when he finished, the call light resumed blinking immediately. "That's strange," he said, checking his work. "Everything tests normal, but the light won't reset." He tried multiple approaches, different button mechanisms, electrical bypasses, temporary disconnection of the call system. Nothing stopped the persistent blinking light that indicated someone in Room 12 was requesting assistance. "I'll need to check the main electrical panel," Rodriguez concluded. "Maybe there's a short in the primary wiring that's causing the malfunction." But examination of the building's electrical systems revealed normal operation. Room 12's call button received proper power, functioned according to specifications, and showed no signs of the electrical problems that might cause persistent activation. Yet, the light continued blinking every night, always beginning at 11:47 p.m. and continuing until approximately 6 a.m. when day shift arrived. Night Supervisor Martinez reviewed the situation, confirming that room 12 was officially vacant and no patient was assigned to the space. The call system must have a technical problem that maintenance can't identify, she decided. We'll disable the light until the issue can be resolved. Rodriguez disconnected the electrical power to room 12's call system, physically removing the wires that carried signals from the room to the nurse's station. But the light continued blinking despite having no electrical connection to activate it. That's impossible, Rodriguez said, examining the disconnected wiring. There's no power source for this light. It shouldn't be operating at all. But the light persisted, blinking steadily at the nurse's station every night from 11:47 p.m. to 6 a.m., indicating that someone in the vacant room 12 was requesting assistance. Other night shift nurses reported the same phenomenon. The empty room's call light, activated precisely at 11:47 p.m., remained active throughout the night and stopped at dawn regardless of maintenance interventions or electrical disconnections. It's just a technical glitch, Day Nurse Patterson suggested. Old buildings have electrical anomalies that are hard to troubleshoot. The light will probably stop malfunctioning eventually. But patients on the ward began reporting disturbances related to room 12's persistent call light. Someone keeps asking for help, patient Williams told me during medication rounds. The voice comes from the empty room, always asking for help. During the night, I couldn't hear any voices from room 12, but Williams and other patients seemed genuinely disturbed by sounds they associated with the vacant room. Patient Garcia reported similar observations. There's a man in room 12 who keeps calling for nurses, but no one answers him. He sounds very sad and frightened. When I explained that room 12 was empty, Garcia looked confused. But I can hear him every night. He calls and calls, but nobody comes to help. I began spending time near room 12 during the hours when the call light was active, listening for any sounds that might explain the patient's reports. The room remained silent, but the call light continued its steady blinking, as if someone were pressing the button repeatedly. On February 3rd, I decided to spend an entire night shift in room 12, attempting to understand what was causing the persistent call light activation. I positioned a chair where I could observe the call button mechanism, brought reading material for the long night, and prepared to document any phenomena that might explain the technical malfunction. At 11:47 p.m., the call light began blinking, but I was watching the call button directly, and it wasn't being pressed. The light activated without any mechanical trigger, as if responding to an invisible signal. I tried pressing the button myself, hoping to reset the system. The button clicked normally, but the blinking pattern didn't change. The light continued its steady rhythm, unaffected by my attempts to interrupt the signal. At 2:30 a.m., while sitting in the dark room, I heard something that made my skin crawl. A faint voice, barely audible, saying, "Help me, please." The voice seemed to come from the exact location where a patient's bed would normally be positioned, though the room contained only my chair and the stripped mattress. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone here?" The voice repeated, "Help me, please." I need help. But I was alone in the room. No patient, no visitor, no explanation for the voice I was hearing clearly. I continued hearing the same plea throughout the night, always from the same location, always in the same tone of distress and confusion, as if someone were lying in an invisible hospital bed, repeatedly pressing a call button and asking for assistance that never arrived. At 6:01 a.m., when the call light stopped blinking, the voice fell silent. I reported the experience to administration, describing the persistent call light malfunction and the voices I'd heard during my overnight observation. "Lisa, you've been working too many double shifts," Supervisor Martinez replied. "Exhaustion can cause auditory hallucinations, especially in isolated environments. Take some time off and get proper rest." But other staff members reported similar experiences. Night orderlies heard voices requesting help from room 12. Security guards found the empty room's door standing open despite being locked at the end of each shift. Cleaning staff reported finding personal items in the room that disappeared when supervisors came to investigate. On February 20th, I was transferred to day shift, officially due to scheduling needs, though I suspected my reports about room 12 had influenced the decision. But even during day hours, I could see room 12's call light blinking steadily at the nurse's station display panel, a constant reminder that someone, somewhere, was requesting assistance that our standard protocols couldn't provide. The call light continues blinking every night, despite multiple maintenance interventions, electrical system upgrades, and eventually, the complete removal of room 12's call button mechanism. Hospital staff have learned to ignore the persistent light, treating it as a technical anomaly that can't be resolved through conventional means. But sometimes, during quiet night shifts, nurses report hearing faint voices from room 12, always asking for help, always expressing the same confusion and distress that brought patients to psychiatric hospitals in the first place. Some call systems, I've learned, respond to needs that transcend electrical connections and mechanical switches, and some patients continue requesting assistance long after their official discharge from the care we're trained to provide. I am Dr. Sarah Mitchell, psychiatric resident at Riverside Medical Center. During my second year of residency training, I encountered a case that challenged my understanding of both medical science and psychiatric diagnosis. The patient's condition defied conventional explanation, yet the clinical evidence was undeniable and witnessed by multiple staff members. On November 12, 2019, police brought in a 34-year-old male for psychiatric evaluation following a public disturbance outside the downtown courthouse. The man, identified as Marcus Webb, had been screaming about losing himself and claiming that mirrors no longer worked for him. His behavior was agitated, confused, and potentially dangerous to public safety. Initial assessment revealed a disheveled but otherwise normal-appearing individual experiencing acute psychological distress. Webb was coherent during intake questioning, though his responses indicated possible delusional thinking centered on identity confusion and perceptual disturbances. "Doctor, you have to understand," Webb told me during our first interview. "Something happened to me 3 days ago. I woke up and I couldn't see myself anymore. Not in mirrors, not in windows, not in any reflective surface." I documented his statement as consistent with depersonalization disorder, a condition where patients feel disconnected from their physical self and may report feeling invisible or unreal. The mirror-related delusions seemed consistent with this diagnosis. Webb's medical history was unremarkable. No previous psychiatric admissions, no documented substance abuse, no family history of mental illness. He worked as an accountant, lived alone, and had no recent stressors that might precipitate a psychotic episode. But during routine physical examination, I observed something that troubled me deeply. The examination room contained a large mirror, mounted on the wall for patient assessment purposes. As I conducted standard medical procedures, I noticed that Webb cast no reflection in the mirror. I could see my own reflection clearly, along with medical equipment and room furnishings, but Webb appeared absent from the reflected image. I initially assumed this was a perceptual error caused by lighting conditions or mirror positioning, but when I moved Webb to different locations relative to the mirror, the result remained consistent. No reflection appeared where his image should have been visible. "Mr. Webb, would you look at yourself in the mirror?" He turned toward the mirror with an expression of profound sadness. "I can't see myself, doctor. That's what I've been trying to tell everyone." I looked at the mirror and confirmed what Webb was experiencing. His physical presence was obvious. I could see him clearly, touch him during examination, observe normal vital signs and physical responses, but the mirror showed no reflection of his existence. I called Dr. Martinez, my supervising physician, to observe this unusual phenomenon. "Sarah, what exactly are you asking me to evaluate?" he said when he arrived at the examination room. "The patient's reflection, Dr. Martinez. Look at the mirror." Martinez positioned himself where he could observe both Webb and the mirror simultaneously. His expression changed from skepticism to confusion as he realized that Webb cast no reflection, despite being clearly visible in the room. "This has to be some kind of optical illusion. Martinez said, examining the mirror from different angles. Mirrors don't selectively exclude specific objects, but no matter how we positioned ourselves or adjusted the lighting, Webb remained absent from all reflected images. Medical equipment, furniture, and staff members appeared normally in the mirror, but Webb existed only in direct observation. Martinez ordered comprehensive medical testing, neurological examination, blood chemistry analysis, psychiatric evaluation, and consultation with ophthalmology to rule out vision-related explanations for what we were observing. All tests returned normal results. Webb showed no signs of neurological dysfunction, metabolic abnormalities, or psychiatric conditions that might account for the reflection anomaly. He was physically and mentally healthy except for the impossible absence of his reflected image. During Webb's 3-day hospitalization, multiple staff members witnessed and documented the reflection phenomenon. Nurses, orderlies, security guards, and visiting physicians all confirmed that Webb cast no reflection in mirrors, windows, or any reflective surface throughout the hospital. "I've never seen anything like this in 20 years of psychiatric practice," Charge Nurse Thompson told me. "The patient is clearly there, interacting normally, but it's like mirrors can't see him." Webb's psychological state improved during hospitalization as staff validated his experience rather than dismissing it as delusional. He wasn't suffering from perceptual disturbances. He was accurately reporting a condition that defied medical explanation. "Dr. Mitchell, I'm not crazy," he said during our final session. "Something happened to me, something that doesn't make sense, but at least now I know other people can see what I see." I documented Webb's condition extensively, including detailed photographs that should have shown his reflection in hospital mirrors. But when the photographs were developed, they confirmed what we'd observed directly. Webb appeared in person, but remained absent from all reflected surfaces captured in the images. On November 15th, Webb was scheduled for discharge. His psychological distress had resolved. He was no longer agitated or confused, and he expressed readiness to return to his normal activities. But his reflection anomaly persisted, creating practical challenges for daily living in a world filled with reflective surfaces. I completed comprehensive discharge documentation, including detailed descriptions of the reflection phenomenon and recommendations for ongoing psychological support to help Webb adapt to his unusual condition. But the next morning, when I came to complete discharge procedures, Webb was gone. Not discharged through normal channels, simply absent from his room, with no record of when or how he'd left the hospital. Security footage showed no evidence of Webb departing through standard exits, and his personal belongings remained in the room as if he'd simply vanished. More disturbing was what happened to his medical records. The comprehensive documentation I'd created, examination notes, test results, photographs, witness statements from staff, had been completely erased from hospital computer systems. According to official records, no patient named Marcus Webb had ever been admitted. The 3 days of detailed medical documentation had disappeared as thoroughly as Webb's reflection had been absent from mirrors. "Dr. Mitchell, are you having problems with patient documentation?" Supervisor Martinez asked when I reported the missing records. "There's no admission record for anyone named Webb during the past week." I insisted that Webb had been a patient, that multiple staff members had witnessed his condition, that comprehensive medical tests had been performed, but none of my colleagues retained any memory of treating a patient with reflection anomaly. "Sarah, you might be experiencing some stress-related confusion," Martinez suggested. "Residency training is demanding, and it's common for residents to occasionally conflate different cases or create false memories about patients. But I had my personal notes, written in my own handwriting, describing every detail of Webb's condition and treatment. Evidence of a patient who had existed, been examined thoroughly, and documented comprehensively before disappearing from both the hospital and all official records. I researched Webb's background information, trying to verify his identity through external sources. No employment records at the accounting firm he'd mentioned, no apartment lease at the address he'd provided, no driver's license or social security records matching his personal details. It was as if Marcus Webb had never existed outside the 3 days he'd spent in our psychiatric ward, lacking reflection, just as he now lacked any trace in official documentation. Months later, I occasionally see patients who remind me of Webb's physical appearance, but their reflections appear normally in hospital mirrors. Sometimes I wonder if I actually encountered someone whose condition existed beyond our medical understanding, or if the entire experience was a manifestation of my own psychological stress during residency training. But I keep my personal notes about Webb's case. Written evidence of a patient who challenged everything I thought I knew about the relationship between physical presence and reflected images. Some conditions, I've learned, affect not just how patients see themselves, but how the world sees them in return. And some medical mysteries resolve themselves by disappearing completely from the records we use to document what should be remembered. My name is Janet Morrison, and I was the charge nurse for the secure unit at Westfield State Psychiatric Hospital for 11 years. The secure unit housed patients requiring intensive supervision due to violent behavior, severe psychotic episodes, or risk of self-harm. When patients posed immediate danger to themselves or others, they were placed in seclusion rooms under strict monitoring protocols that required documentation every 15 minutes. Seclusion logging was one of our most critical responsibilities. State regulations mandated precise records of patient condition, vital signs, attempts at verbal de-escalation, and any changes in behavior that might indicate readiness for return to general population. These logs were reviewed by supervisors, state inspectors, and legal authorities if questions arose about patient treatment. On March 8, 2020, we placed patient Richardson in seclusion room 3 following an aggressive episode during group therapy. Richardson had attacked another patient without warning, required physical restraint by security staff, and showed signs of acute paranoid psychosis that made him unsuitable for normal ward activities. Richardson was a 41-year-old man with a long history of schizoaffective disorder, multiple previous hospitalizations, and documented episodes of violence during psychotic decompensation. His current admission resulted from a public disturbance involving threats against government officials and claims that federal agents were monitoring his thoughts. Standard seclusion procedure required continuous observation for the first 4 hours, with detailed logging every 15 minutes documenting patient behavior, attempts at communication, vital signs, and any interventions provided by nursing staff. I began Richardson's seclusion log at 2:15 p.m., noting his agitated state, rapid breathing, and continued verbal expressions of paranoid delusions. He paced continuously within the small room, occasionally striking the padded walls, and refused all attempts at verbal de-escalation. 15 p.m., patient placed in seclusion following aggressive incident. Agitated, pacing, refusing verbal interaction. Vital signs: BP 140/90, HR 95, RR 22. J. Morrison, RN 2:30 p.m. Patient continues pacing, appears to be responding to internal stimuli. No verbal response to staff attempts at communication. Vital signs: stable. J. Morrison, RN 2:45 p.m. No. Change in behavior. Patient striking walls, muttering incomprehensibly. Water offered, refused. J. Morrison, RN standard documentation that reflected Richardson's expected behavior during acute psychotic episodes. But by 4 p.m., his demeanor began changing in ways that seemed inconsistent with his previous patterns. The p.m., patient appears calmer, ceased pacing, sitting quietly in corner, appears to be listening to something. No obvious external stimuli present. J. Morrison, RN Richardson, had stopped his agitated pacing and assumed a position of attentive listening, as if someone were speaking to him in conversation tones. But seclusion rooms contain no audio systems, no communication devices, and no way for patients to hear voices from outside the secure area. 15 p.m. Patient remains seated, occasionally nodding as if agreeing with speaker. When asked who he's listening to, patient responds, "The names. They're telling me the names." J. Morrison, RN. "What names?" I asked, through the observation window. "Margaret Stevens, James Patterson, Dorothy Chen." Richardson replied clearly. "They want to make sure I remember them correctly. These names meant nothing to me. not staff members, not patients I recognized, not individuals Richardson had mentioned during previous admissions. But he repeated them with careful precision, as if memorizing important information. 30 p.m. Patient continues listing names. Robert Martinez, Helen Thompson, David Williams. Claims these individuals are important for the records. No agitation. Vital signs normal. J. Morrison, RNI, completed my shift at 7 p.m., turning Richardson's care over to night shift nurse Patricia Wong. But when I reviewed the seclusion log the following morning, I found entries that troubled me deeply. The log contained detailed observations extending through the entire night, documented every 15 minutes as required by regulations. But several entries were signed by staff, members who hadn't been scheduled for duty. Gauss 45 p.m. Patient resting quietly, vital signs stable. Names recitation continues periodically. Sarah Johnson, Michael Davis, Linda Rodriguez, K. Stevens, RN 12 RJM. No change in condition. Patient appears comfortable. No signs of distress. Continues whispering names in organized sequence. K. Stevens, RN, but K. Stevens hadn't worked at Westfield for over 3 years, having transferred to a different facility in 2017. Yet multiple entries throughout the night were signed with her name, documented in handwriting that appeared to match her style. 15 a.m. Patient sleeping peacefully. Vital signs normal. When awake, continues reciting names with careful attention to pronunciation. R. Harrison, RNR. Harrison had died in 2018, 2 years before Richardson's admission. But the log contained extensive entries signed with Harrison's name, documenting detailed observations of Richardson's condition throughout the night. I questioned night nurse Wong about the mysterious log entries. Patricia, who actually conducted Richardson's seclusion monitoring last night. I did, following standard protocol, she replied. Every 15 minutes, just like the regulations require. The log shows entries signed by Stevens and Harrison. Were they here last night? Wong looked confused. Janet, I don't know anyone named Stevens or Harrison. I made all the entries myself, signed with my own name. But when I showed her the log, Wong's expression changed to concern. These aren't my entries, she said, examining the handwriting. I documented Richardson's condition, but these signatures aren't mine. I compared Wong's normal handwriting to the mysterious entries. The documentation styles were completely different, suggesting multiple people had been monitoring Richardson, despite Wong's insistence that she'd worked alone. More entries appeared over the following days, all signed by staff members who were either off duty, transferred to other facilities, or deceased. But each entry demonstrated comprehensive knowledge of Richardson's condition, appropriate medical observations, and proper seclusion monitoring protocols. Day 2, 6:30 a.m. Patient awake, alert, cooperative. Name recitation has become more organized, listing individuals by apparent time periods. Vital signs normal. M. Sir Blackwood, M.D. Doctor. M. Sir Blackwood had been Westfield's chief psychiatrist from 1985 to 1995, deceased since 2003. Yet his signature appeared on Richardson's seclusion log, documenting medical observations with the expertise and attention to detail he'd been known for during his tenure. Richardson's condition remained stable throughout his seclusion period, but his behavior became increasingly focused on the systematic recitation of names. He would spend hours carefully pronouncing unfamiliar names, occasionally asking invisible speakers to repeat information so he could document it accurately. Richardson, who's giving you these names? I asked during one of my monitoring visits. The staff, he replied simply. They want to make sure their names are remembered correctly in the records. What staff? There's no one here but me. The nurses, the doctors, the orderlies, everyone who worked here. They're worried their names will be forgotten if someone doesn't write them down properly. I researched the names Richardson had been reciting, cross-referencing them with Westfield's employment records, dating back to the hospital's opening in 1963. Every name he mentioned matched former staff members listed in chronological order according to their years of service. But Richardson had no access to personnel records, no way to obtain comprehensive information about decades of hospital employees. Yet he continued reciting names with remarkable accuracy, providing details about job positions, length of service, and even personal information about staff members he'd never met. Day 5, 2:15 p.m. Patient completing systematic review of hospital staff names from 1963 present. Pronunciation careful. Details accurate according to personnel records. Vital signs stable. T. Chen, RNT. Chen had worked at Westfield from 1998 to 2006, transferred to another facility years before Richardson's admission. But Chen's signature appeared regularly in the seclusion log, documenting Richardson's progress with the same professionalism he'd demonstrated during his actual employment. On March 15th, Richardson's name recitation reached the present era. He began listing current staff members, including details about our work schedules, personal backgrounds, and professional qualifications that he shouldn't have known. Janet Morrison, charge. Nurse, 11 years of service, he said during my evening monitoring visit. Specializes in secure unit management, experienced with seclusion protocols. He continued through the entire current staff roster, providing accurate information about employees he'd never met, positions he'd never been told about, and personal details that weren't part of his medical records. Day 7, 8 p.m. Patient completing final staff name documentation. All personnel from hospital's operational history, now recorded. Patient appears satisfied with completion of task. J. Morrison, R.N. Richardson's name recitation ended that evening. He'd systematically documented every individual who'd ever worked at Westfield, spanning 57 years of hospital operation, with accuracy that hospital administration confirmed against comprehensive personnel records. But on March 16th, when I arrived for my morning shift, Richardson was found unresponsive in seclusion room 3. Medical examination revealed no obvious cause of death, no signs of trauma, no indication of medical emergency, no evidence of self-harm. Richardson had simply stopped breathing during the night, his vital signs ceasing as quietly as his name recitation had concluded. The final entry in his seclusion log was signed by Richardson himself. Day 8, 3:27 a.m. Task completed. All names properly documented for permanent record. Staff roster preservation accomplished. End of assignment. W. Richardson. Richardson's handwriting was clear, professional, and completely different from his usual chaotic scrawl during psychotic episodes. The entry was calm, organized, and written with the competence of someone completing important administrative work. I've kept Richardson's seclusion log, along with the comprehensive list of names he documented during his final week. Sometimes I wonder if his psychotic episode was actually a form of institutional memory preservation, ensuring that every person who'd contributed to Westfield's operation would be remembered in official records. Some patients, I've learned, serve purposes beyond their individual treatment needs, and some seclusion periods allow individuals to complete work that transcends their personal psychiatric conditions, documenting histories that might otherwise be lost when institutions close and staff members are forgotten. My name is Carlos Rivera, and I worked as an orderly at Pine Valley Psychiatric Hospital for 4 years. Orderly duties included patient transport, facility maintenance, supply distribution, and general support for nursing staff throughout the hospital's 3 main buildings. The work required familiarity with the facility's layout, which included numerous interconnected corridors that could be confusing for new employees. The hospital's main building contained Ward C, a long corridor that connected the east and west wings through a central hallway approximately 200 feet in length. This corridor served as a primary route for staff movement between wings and was used regularly for patient transport, meal delivery, and routine facility operations. Ward C's design was straightforward, a single hallway with patient rooms along both sides, nursing station at the midpoint, and exit doors at each end providing access to the east and west wings. Standard institutional layout that I'd navigated hundreds of times during my employment. On February 22, 2021, I was assigned to transport supplies from the West Wing storage area to the East Wing medication room. This required carrying medical supplies through Ward C's corridor, a routine task that typically took 5 to 7 minutes depending on the weight of the materials being transported. My colleague, Antonio Vasquez, was simultaneously assigned to transport laundry from the East Wing to the West Wing, using the same corridor, but traveling in the opposite direction. We coordinated our timing to avoid congestion, with Antonio entering from the east while I entered from the west. At 2:15 p.m. I entered Ward C from the West Wing door, carrying a box of medical supplies intended for the East Wing medication room. The corridor appeared normal. Patient rooms on both sides, nursing station at the midpoint, exit door visible at the far end. I began walking toward the East Wing, expecting to encounter Antonio coming from the opposite direction sometime around the corridor's midpoint. But as I continued walking, the East Wing door seemed to remain at the same distance despite my steady progress forward. After what felt like 10 minutes of walking, I still hadn't reached the midpoint nursing station. The corridor stretched ahead of me unchanged, with the same patient room doors, the same institutional lighting, the same view of the distant exit door that never seemed to get closer. I stopped walking and looked back toward the West Wing entrance. It was no longer visible behind me. The corridor extended in both directions as far as I could see, with no indication of the entrance I'd used or the exit I was trying to reach. But I could see Antonio in the distance ahead of me, walking in my direction, carrying his laundry cart. He appeared to be making normal progress, but despite both of us walking toward each other, the distance between us remained constant. I called out to Antonio. "How long have you been walking?" His voice echoed from the distance. "About 15 minutes. This corridor is longer than I remembered." We continued walking toward each other for what felt like another 20 minutes, but neither of us seemed to get closer to the other. The corridor maintained its standard appearance, but the dimensions had apparently changed to accommodate our extended journey. I tried reaching one of the patient rooms to ask for directions or assistance, but when I approached room 214, the Dr. handle wouldn't turn. Not locked. The handle simply wouldn't engage, as if it were painted in place rather than functionally installed. Antonio reported the same experience with doors on his side of the corridor. "Carlos, none of these doors work. They look normal, but I can't open any of them." We agreed to turn around and return to our respective starting points, abandoning the supply transport until we could understand what was happening with Ward C's layout. But when I turned around and began walking back toward where the West Wing entrance should have been, I found myself walking away from Antonio rather than toward the exit. The corridor continued indefinitely in both directions, with no landmarks or reference points to indicate progress. I walked for approximately 30 minutes in what I believed was the direction of the West Wing entrance. But I never reached an exit door, never found the nursing station, never encountered any features that would indicate I was making progress through the corridor. Antonio's voice continued echoing from the distance, always seeming to come from the same relative position despite both of us moving continuously. "Carlos, I can't find the exit doors. This corridor doesn't end." I began checking my watch regularly, documenting the time I'd spent in Ward C. But the numbers became confusing. According to my watch, I'd been walking for 3 hours, though my subjective experience suggested only 30 or 40 minutes had passed. At 5:30 p.m., according to my timepiece, I decided to stop walking and wait for assistance. Surely someone would notice that Antonio and I had been missing from our duties for over 3 hours and send help. But when I stopped moving, I could no longer see Antonio. The corridor stretched empty in both directions, with no sign of my colleague, or any other staff members. I remained stationary for what felt like another hour, expecting someone to find me. But Ward C remained empty, silent, extending infinitely without exit doors or intersection points that might provide alternative routes. Finally, I heard voices calling my name from what sounded like a great distance. "Carlos, Antonio, where are you?" I called back. "In Ward C. We can't find the exit doors." The voices grew closer, and eventually I saw Supervisor Martinez and Security Officer Davis approaching from what appeared to be the East Wing direction. "Carlos, what are you doing?" Martinez asked when they reached me. You've been standing in one spot for 20 minutes, staring down an empty corridor. I looked around. I was standing near the West Wing entrance to Ward C, exactly where I'd started my supply transport assignment. The corridor showed its normal proportions. 200 feet long, nursing station at midpoint, East Wing exit clearly visible at the far end. "I've been walking for hours," I insisted. The corridor was endless, and I couldn't reach Antonio or find the exit doors. Martinez checked his watch. "Carlos, it's 2:35 p.m. You've been missing from your duties for 20 minutes, not hours, but..." My watch showed 5:47 p.m., indicating I'd spent over 3 hours in Ward C's impossible corridor. Security Officer Davis reviewed the surveillance footage from Ward C's cameras. The recording showed Antonio and me entering the corridor from opposite ends at 2:15 p.m., walking a few steps, then standing motionless for approximately 20 minutes before Martinez and Davis came to investigate. According to the video, neither Antonio nor I had walked more than 10 feet into the corridor. We'd both stopped almost immediately after entering and remained stationary until help arrived. But Antonio's experience matched mine exactly. Hours of walking through an endless corridor, attempting to reach each other without success, being unable to find exit doors or functional room entrances. "The video must be wrong," Antonio insisted. I walked for at least 2 hours, trying to reach Carlos and find the West Wing exit. His watch also showed incorrect time, nearly 4 hours later than the actual time according to hospital clocks. Supervisor. Martinez reviewed Ward C's maintenance records, looking for structural changes or environmental factors that might have affected our perception of the corridor's dimensions. "Nothing unusual," he reported. "Standard corridor, 200 feet long, no recent modifications." The surveillance video shows normal activity, but Antonio and I both retained clear memories of spending hours in an impossibly extended version of Ward C, unable to reach each other despite walking continuously in opposite directions. We were both reassigned to different duties, avoiding Ward C for the remainder of our employment. But other staff members occasionally reported similar experiences, entering the corridor and finding it longer than expected, spending extended time trying to reach destinations that should have been quickly accessible. The incidents were always brief according to surveillance cameras and witness observations, but staff members involved reported subjective experiences of hours spent in corridors that had temporarily expanded beyond their architectural limits. He transferred to a different hospital 6 months later, citing schedule conflicts, though the real reason was my reluctance to work in a building where corridors could change length without warning. Some institutional spaces, I've learned, expand to accommodate whatever duration is needed for employees to complete their assigned duties, regardless of the time constraints imposed by normal architectural dimensions. I am Dr. Michael Torres, staff psychiatrist at Riverside Psychiatric Institute. For 8 years, I've conducted intake interviews with newly admitted patients, assessing their mental status, determining appropriate treatment protocols, and creating comprehensive records that guide therapeutic interventions throughout their hospitalization. Our facility utilizes video recording equipment for training purposes, allowing resident physicians and nursing students to observe professional intake procedures without disrupting the therapeutic relationship between doctor and patient. These recordings require patient consent and are stored securely according to strict confidentiality protocols. On April 14, 2021, I was scheduled to conduct an intake interview with a new admission, though the patient's name and details weren't immediately available due to administrative processing delays. Emergency admissions sometimes arrive with incomplete paperwork, requiring clinicians to gather essential information during the initial assessment session. I set up the recording equipment in interview room 3, a standard procedure for sessions that would be used for educational purposes. The camera was positioned to capture both patient and clinician perspectives, while maintaining appropriate privacy boundaries. At 10:30 a.m., I began what I believed would be a routine intake interview, though I have no clear memory of the patient. Entering the room were the initial phases of our conversation, but 3 days later, when I reviewed the recording for training curriculum development, I found footage that challenged my understanding of the entire session. The video showed me conducting a comprehensive intake interview with a middle-aged man I didn't recognize. The patient appeared calm, cooperative, and answered questions with appropriate detail about his psychological history, current symptoms, and circumstances leading to his hospitalization. "Can you tell me what brought you to the hospital today?" my recorded voice asked. "I've been experiencing increasing anxiety over the past month," the patient replied. "Panic attacks, insomnia, difficulty concentrating at work. My family became concerned when I started talking about feeling like I wasn't real anymore." The interview continued for 47 minutes, covering standard intake topics: mental health history, medication background, family psychiatric history, substance use assessment, and current symptoms. Both the patient and I appeared professional, engaged, and following appropriate clinical protocols. But I had no memory of conducting this interview. The patient described symptoms consistent with depersonalization disorder, provided detailed personal history, and demonstrated clear thinking throughout the assessment. He appeared to be a legitimate psychiatric admission requiring standard treatment interventions. Yet when I checked our admission records for April 14th, no patient matching his description had been processed through our facility. I reviewed the patient census, intake logs, and administrative files. No record of admitting anyone who matched the individual in the video recording. According to official documentation, I hadn't conducted any intake interviews on April 14th. But the video evidence was undeniable. 47 minutes of comprehensive psychiatric assessment conducted in our standard interview room using proper clinical protocols and resulting in appropriate diagnostic impressions. I brought the recording to Dr. Williams, our clinical director, requesting assistance in identifying the patient and locating his admission paperwork. "Michael, I don't show any intake interviews scheduled for you on April 14th, Dr. Williams said, reviewing the appointment calendar. "You were assigned to group therapy sessions and chart reviews that day." I showed him the video recording. "But here's clear evidence of a comprehensive intake assessment. The patient appears legitimate, the clinical content is appropriate, and the session follows standard protocols." Dr. Williams watched the entire recording carefully, noting the professional quality of the assessment and the apparent authenticity of the patient's responses. "This is excellent clinical work," he observed. "But I don't recognize the patient, and we have no admission record for anyone matching his description." We contacted administration, requesting a comprehensive search of all patient records for individuals who might match the mystery patient's description. The search included discharged patients, transferred cases, and emergency holds that might not have been processed through standard channels. No matches found. The patient in the video appeared to have never been admitted to our facility, despite clear evidence of a detailed intake assessment conducted in our interview room. More puzzling was my complete lack of memory regarding the session. I could remember other activities from April 14th, group therapy sessions, administrative meetings, chart reviews, but the 47-minute intake interview had vanished from my recollection. Could this be someone else using interview room 3? I asked Dr. Williams. We checked the room scheduling logs. Room 3 was assigned to me from 10:30 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. on April 14th for intake interview purposes. No other clinicians were authorized to use the room during that time frame. The recording equipment showed no signs of tampering or unauthorized use. The video was properly formatted, time-stamped correctly, and stored in the appropriate location within our security system. But the patient remained unidentifiable, and I remained unable to recall conducting the interview. I consulted with our IT department, wondering if the recording might be from a different date or had been misfiled from another clinician's sessions. Dr. Torres, the metadata shows this recording was created on April 14th at 10:30 a.m. using your login credentials, the technician reported. The video is authentic, unedited, and matches the specifications of your standard interview recordings. We expanded our search to include patients from other psychiatric facilities in the region, wondering if the mystery patient might have been transferred from another hospital with incomplete documentation. No matches found in the regional psychiatric database. The patient appeared to exist only in the 47-minute video recording. Dr. Williams suggested I review the clinical content more carefully, looking for clues that might help identify the patient or explain how the recording had been created. Without my conscious participation, I studied the video obsessively, analyzing every detail of the patient's responses, looking for inconsistencies or signs that might indicate the nature of this impossible documentation. The patient's clinical presentation was entirely consistent with depersonalization disorder. His symptoms, history, and psychological state suggested genuine psychiatric distress requiring appropriate treatment. There was nothing artificial or deceptive about his responses, but his personal details didn't correspond to any real individual. The address he provided didn't exist, the employer he mentioned wasn't listed in business directories, and the family members he referenced couldn't be located through any available records. It was as if someone had created a perfectly realistic psychiatric patient who existed only during the 47 minutes of our recorded interview. On May 15th, exactly 1 month after the mysterious recording, I found something that made my hands shake. A second video file in my intake interview folder. The new recording showed the same patient, same interview room, same clinical assessment. But this time, the session was dated May 15th, and I again had no memory of conducting the interview. The patient appeared unchanged. Same symptoms, same history, same professional demeanor. But his responses suggested awareness of our previous session. "Dr. Torres, I want to thank you for the assessment we conducted last month," he said during the opening minutes. "Your diagnostic impressions were very helpful for my understanding of the depersonalization symptoms. But according to hospital records, no patient matching his description had ever received treatment at our facility. No follow-up appointments had been scheduled, no treatment plans had been implemented, no ongoing care had been provided. Yet the patient referred to our previous session with specific details that matched the recorded interview exactly. I contacted Dr. Williams immediately, reporting the second impossible recording and requesting immediate investigation of our video recording systems. "Michael, are you feeling all right?" Dr. Williams asked. "You seem concerned about routine interview recordings. These appear to be standard intake assessments with appropriate clinical content." But when Dr. Williams reviewed the recordings, he expressed the same confusion about the unidentifiable patient and my lack of memory regarding the sessions. The recordings continued appearing monthly. Same patient, same interview room, same clinical quality, but with no corresponding admission records or conscious memory of conducting the assessments. Each session built upon previous interviews, suggesting ongoing therapeutic relationship with a patient, who existed only in video documentation. By September, I had documented 5 comprehensive intake interviews with the mystery patient, totaling over 4 hours of clinical assessment time that I couldn't remember, and that wasn't reflected in any official hospital records. I requested transfer to a different facility, citing concerns about memory issues and the need for medical evaluation. But I kept copies of the impossible recordings, evidence of clinical work that transcended my conscious participation in the therapeutic process. Some therapeutic relationships, I've learned, exist in dimensions beyond standard documentation and conscious memory. And some patients require assessment and treatment that can only be provided by clinicians willing to participate in sessions they'll never remember conducting. My name is Rebecca Martinez, head nurse for the night shift at Cedarbrook Psychiatric Hospital. Over 13 years of psychiatric nursing, I've supervised patient care during overnight hours when staffing is minimal and medical emergencies require rapid response from experienced personnel. Night shift nursing demands vigilance, clinical expertise, and careful coordination of limited resources to ensure patient safety. During the summer of 2020, our night shift staff began reporting sightings of an unidentified woman in hospital corridors. The figure appeared to be a healthcare professional, middle-aged, wearing a pristine white nursing gown that was reminiscent of uniforms from earlier decades, and carrying a clipboard as if conducting routine patient assessments. Initial reports came from orderlies during their routine security rounds. "Ms. Martinez, there's a nurse on Ward B that I don't recognize," Orderly Jackson told me during shift briefing. "Older woman, very professional looking, but she's not wearing a current ID badge. Hospital policy required all staff to display current identification badges with photographs and security access codes. Unauthorized personnel were prohibited." from patient care areas, and security would escort anyone lacking proper credentials from the premises. "Did you speak with her?" I asked. I tried, but she was walking away when I saw her, moved very purposefully, like she had specific duties to complete. I reviewed the night shift schedule, 3 nurses assigned to Ward B, all accounted for and wearing proper identification. No additional nursing staff had been scheduled, and no agency nurses had been contracted for temporary coverage. Maybe it was someone from day shift staying late to complete documentation, I suggested, though shift change protocols made this unlikely. But sightings of the unidentified woman continued throughout the week. Different staff members, different locations but consistent descriptions. Professional healthcare worker in white gown, carrying clipboard, moving with obvious purpose through patient care areas. She was checking patient rooms, reported night nurse Chen after her rounds on Ward C. Going from door to door, making notes on her clipboard. Very systematic approach. Did you see her face clearly? Not really. She was always moving away when I noticed her. And the corridor lighting isn't great during night hours. I began conducting additional supervisory rounds, attempting to identify the mysterious figure and determine whether we had unauthorized personnel accessing patient areas. But during my extended patrols, I saw no one matching the described appearance. On July 18th, I encountered the woman myself. During my 3 a.m. rounds, I saw her at the end of Ward A's corridor, examining a patient chart outside room 12. She appeared, exactly as staff had described. Older woman in pristine white nursing gown, professional demeanor, clipboard in hand, conducting routine nursing duties. I approached quickly, intending to verify her credentials and determine her authorization for patient care access. "Excuse me," I called out. "I need to see your identification." The woman looked up from the chart briefly, made a final notation on her clipboard, and walked briskly toward the stairwell. I followed, but when I reached the stairwell door, she was gone. No footsteps on the stairs, no indication of which direction she'd taken. But outside room 12, I found something that troubled me deeply. Detailed nursing notes written in handwriting I didn't recognize, documenting patient observations that were remarkably comprehensive and clinically accurate. Patient Morrison, room 12. Increased agitation during evening hours, refusing medication, expressing paranoid ideation about staff intentions. Recommend psychiatric consultation and medication adjustment. Monitor closely for potential aggressive behavior. The observations were precisely accurate. Morrison had been increasingly difficult during recent shifts, showing resistance to treatment and signs of escalating paranoid symptoms. But no staff member had documented these concerns in such detail. I checked the signatures on nursing notes from recent shifts. None matched the handwriting on the anonymous documentation found outside room 12. The following night, I positioned myself where I could observe Ward A's corridor continuously, determined to identify the mysterious woman and understand her unauthorized presence in patient care areas. At 2:47 a.m., I saw her emerge from room 8, carrying her clipboard and moving with the same purposeful demeanor staff had reported. This time I was close enough to observe her clearly. The woman appeared to be in her 50s, with gray hair arranged in a neat professional style typical of experienced nurses. Her white gown was immaculate, pressed to crisp perfection and reminiscent of nursing uniforms from the 1960s or 1970s. But she wore no identification badge, no hospital nameplate, no security access card that would indicate authorized employment. I followed her discreet distance, watching as she stopped at room 15, consulted her clipboard, and made additional notations while observing the sleeping patient through the door window. When she moved to room 18, I approached close enough to see her writing. The handwriting was neat, professional, and documented detailed patient observations. Patient Davis, room 18, responding well to current medication regimen, sleeping peacefully. Vital signs, stable during overnight monitoring. Continue current. Treatment plan. The observation was accurate, but no authorized staff member had conducted such detailed assessment of patient Davis during the night shift. "Excuse me," I said, approaching from behind. The woman turned slightly, acknowledged my presence with a professional nod, then continued walking toward the nurse's station. But when I reached the nurse's station, she was nowhere to be seen. On her clipboard, left on the counter, I found comprehensive nursing notes for every patient on Ward A. Detailed observations, medication assessments, behavioral notations, and treatment recommendations. All written in the same neat handwriting, all clinically appropriate and remarkably thorough. But at the bottom of the documentation, I found something that made my blood run cold. Patient Thompson, room 23. Critical status anticipated. Recommend. Immediate physician consultation. Probable cardiac event within 24 hours. Prepare for emergency intervention. Patient Thompson had shown no signs of medical distress during standard monitoring. His vital signs were normal, his psychiatric condition was stable, and he'd given no indication of physical health problems. But the anonymous documentation predicted a cardiac emergency with specific timing and clinical detail that seemed impossible to determine through routine observation. I immediately checked on Thompson. He was sleeping peacefully, breathing normally, showing no signs of distress. But I documented the mysterious prediction and increased monitoring protocols as a precautionary measure. At 4:23 a.m. the following morning, patient Thompson experienced sudden cardiac arrest. Emergency medical intervention was successful due to rapid response, but Thompson required immediate transfer to intensive care for cardiac monitoring and treatment. The prediction found on the mysterious clipboard had been accurate to within hours. I reported the incident to hospital administration, describing the unidentified woman, the detailed nursing documentation, and the accurate prediction of Thompson's medical emergency. Rebecca, are you suggesting that unauthorized personnel are accessing patient areas and somehow predicting medical crises? Administrator Johnson asked skeptically. The explanation sounded impossible, but the evidence was undeniable. Comprehensive nursing notes written by someone with no official employment, clinical observations that exceeded the detail of standard documentation, and medical predictions that proved accurate. Security reviewed surveillance footage from Ward A during the time frames when the woman had been observed. The cameras showed authorized staff members conducting routine duties, but no footage of an unidentified woman in white gown. The video shows only scheduled nursing staff, Security Supervisor Davis reported. No unauthorized personnel appear in any of the recorded footage. But staff continued reporting sightings of the woman, and detailed nursing notes continued appearing throughout the facility. Always the same professional handwriting, always comprehensive clinical observations, always signed with initials that didn't match any current employee. On August 15th, I found a note that contained information about my own performance. Supervisor Martinez demonstrates excellent clinical judgment and staff leadership. Recommendation for administrative advancement appropriate. Consider promotion to Assistant Director of Nursing Services. The following week, I was approached by administration about advancement opportunities within the hospital's nursing leadership structure. Some healthcare professionals, I've learned, continue their duties long after their official employment has ended, providing patient care that transcends the limitations of standard work schedules and authorized personnel rosters. And some clinical documentation is created by nurses who understand that patient safety requires supervision that extends beyond the boundaries of conventional staffing patterns. My name is Margaret Chen, and I served as night shift supervisor at Hillview Psychiatric Hospital for 9 years. One of my primary responsibilities was completing the daily census count, documenting the exact number of patients present in each ward during overnight hours. This information was essential for staffing calculations, resource allocation, and state reporting requirements that determined hospital operating licenses. Census counting was straightforward but critical work. Each patient room required verification of occupancy. Empty beds needed documentation, and any discrepancies had to be investigated immediately. State regulations mandated precise patient counts, and hospitals faced serious consequences for inaccurate reporting. Ward 3 housed our long-term psychiatric patients, individuals requiring extended treatment for severe mental health conditions. The ward contained 32 beds arranged in single occupancy rooms, with typical occupancy rates ranging between 28 and 30 patients depending on admissions, discharges, and transfers. For 8 years, my census counts for Ward 3 matched physical reality. Occupied rooms correlated with patient census, empty beds aligned with available capacity, and total numbers reflected actual conditions observed during nightly rounds. But in November 2019, I began noticing persistent discrepancies in Ward 3's census numbers. My physical count of occupied rooms consistently showed 29 patients present, but when I completed the official census documentation, the form always indicated 30 patients total. Initially, I assumed I was making counting errors during routine rounds. Psychiatric hospital work is demanding. Night shifts can be exhausting, and simple mathematical mistakes are common during repetitive tasks. I began double-checking my counts, using systematic approaches to ensure accuracy, walking each corridor, methodically, marking room numbers on paper, verifying occupancy through direct observation of sleeping patients. The physical count remained consistent. 29 occupied rooms, 3 vacant beds, total patient population of 29 individuals. But the official census form continued showing 30 patients, regardless of my careful verification procedures. "Margaret, your census numbers don't match the admission logs," Administrator Williams mentioned during our weekly supervisory meeting. "You're reporting 30 patients in Ward 3, but our records show only 29 current admissions," I explained. The discrepancy I'd been observing. "Sir, I physically count 29 patients during rounds, but the census form somehow shows 30 when I complete the documentation. Are you sure you're counting correctly? Census accuracy is essential for state compliance." I was certain of my counting methodology, but I couldn't explain why the written documentation differed from my observed reality. Williams suggested I bring additional staff to verify the census count, ensuring that multiple observers confirmed the patient population before submitting official reports. The next evening, I asked Night Nurse Thompson to accompany me during Ward 3 census rounds. We walked each corridor together, verified room occupancy collaboratively, and maintained careful count throughout the process. 29 patients present, Thompson confirmed after our systematic review. Rooms 301, 315, and 327 are vacant. All other rooms are occupied. But when we completed the census form together, both of us writing simultaneously, the document showed 30 patients total. "That's impossible," Thompson said, checking our paperwork. "We both counted 29, but the form indicates 30. We repeated the count twice more, achieving identical results. Physical observation showed 29 patients, but official documentation reflected 30. "Maybe there's a problem with the census forms," Thompson suggested. "Could be a printing error or administrative mistake." I requested new census forms from administration, hoping that fresh paperwork might resolve the mathematical discrepancy. But the new forms produced identical results. Regardless of actual patient count, the documentation consistently showed one additional individual. In December, the discrepancy intensified when I discovered something that challenged my understanding of the entire situation. During routine rounds, I found a patient in room 300, a room that didn't exist according to hospital floor plans. Room numbers in Ward 3 began with 301 and continued sequentially through 332. There was no room 300 on any architectural drawing, fire safety plan, or administrative documentation, but the room existed physically. Standard patient accommodation with bed, furniture, and medical equipment identical to other rooms throughout the ward, and it was occupied. An elderly man, approximately 70 years old, sleeping peacefully in the bed. He appeared to be a legitimate psychiatric patient. Hospital gown, medical identification bracelet, chart holder on the door containing detailed treatment records. I examined the medical chart. Patient 0, according to the identification system, admitted for census maintenance duties with no discharge date specified. The documentation was comprehensive, professionally written, but contained information that made no sense within standard psychiatric care protocols. Patient demonstrates excellent compliance with institutional requirements. Primary function involves maintaining accurate facility population counts. No psychiatric intervention required. Permanent residency status approved. I'd never seen medical records describing census maintenance duties. or permanent residency status for psychiatric patients. But the chart appeared authentic, complete with physician signatures and treatment notations spanning several years. The next morning, I reported the discovery of room 300 and its mysterious occupant to Administrator Williams, Margaret, Ward 3. "Contains rooms 301 through 332, Williams replied, consulting the architectural plans. "There is no room 300 in our facility." I insisted he accompany me to verify the room's existence and examine the patient records. But when we arrived at Ward 3, the space where room 300 had been located showed only a maintenance closet. "This is a storage area," Williams said, opening the door to reveal cleaning supplies and equipment. It's been a closet since the building was constructed, but I had clear memories of entering room 300, observing patient 0, and reviewing his extensive medical chart. The room had been as real as any other patient accommodation in the facility. That evening, I returned to Ward 3 and found room 300 exactly where I'd observed it the previous night. Same layout, same patient, same medical records. But this time, I found a note on the patient chart written in red ink, Supervisor Chen. "Thank you for conducting accurate census counts. Patient 0 appreciates professional documentation that acknowledges his presence. Continue current protocols." Patient 0, the handwriting was neat, professional, and completely different from the medical notations written by hospital staff. But it was signed by the patient himself, despite his apparent inability to write coherent documents. I approached the sleeping figure. "Excuse me, did you write this note?" Patient 0 opened his eyes and looked at me with an expression of profound gratitude. "Supervisor Chen, I want to thank you for including me in the census counts. It's important that I'm properly documented." "What are your census maintenance duties?" I asked. "I ensure that hospitals maintain accurate population records," he replied calmly. "Sometimes institutions lose track of their residents, forget about individuals who need ongoing care. My presence guarantees that someone is always counted, always remembered." "How long have you been here?" "Since the beginning. Since hospitals started keeping census records. Someone has to be patient 0, the baseline count that makes all other numbers meaningful." Our conversation was interrupted by Administrator Williams calling my name from the corridor. When I turned to respond, patient 0 smiled and closed his eyes, returning to his peaceful sleep. Williams approached with security personnel, apparently concerned about my reports of non-existent rooms and phantom patients. "Margaret, you've been working too many consecutive shifts," he said gently. "I think you need some time off to rest and recover." But when they examined the area where room 300 was located, they found only the maintenance closet, exactly as Williams had observed during our previous visit. I was granted 2 weeks of administrative leave, with recommendations for medical evaluation and counseling to address work-related stress. But I kept careful personal records of my census counts, documenting the persistent discrepancy between observed reality and official documentation. When I returned to work, Ward 3's census continued, showing one more patient than physical counts revealed. But I no longer reported the discrepancy, no longer mentioned room 300 or patient 0. No longer questioned why the numbers never aligned. Some hospitals require baseline patients who ensure that census counts never reach 0, that institutions never appear completely empty, that someone is always present to maintain the continuity of care that defines medical facilities. And some census numbers reflect populations that transcend standard admission and discharge procedures, documenting residents whose presence guarantees that hospitals never lose track of their fundamental purpose, providing care for those who can never truly leave. I no longer fight the discrepancy. Each night I complete the census. I write the number is 30, knowing it will always remain so. My pen moves steadily, my signature beneath the red mark of another hand I will not acknowledge aloud. Patient 0 never speaks now, at least not directly, but sometimes, when I pass the corridor where room 300 should be, I hear the faint scratch of writing from behind the closet door. It sounds like census paperwork being filled in. Calm, precise, eternal. I've come to believe that every hospital has its own patient 0, a figure who ensures that numbers never vanish completely, that there is always someone to record, someone to count. Not a ghost in the traditional sense, but a presence bound to the bureaucracy of care itself. So when the totals don't match, when the sheets come back with red ink signatures, I accept them without protest. Because some patients are never discharged. They remain behind every census, every logbook, every chart. And in psychiatric wards especially, the most unsettling truth is this: there is always one more patient than anyone can see.